Olympus was ash. Kratos walked through what had once been the throne of heaven. The marble columns lay broken like the ribs of some immense corpse, their gilded surfaces dulled by soot and blood. No thunder rolled across these heights. No divine light pierced the smoke that rose from cracks in the mountain's flesh. The gods were dead, and their deaths had left the world gray. He moved without urgency. Each step crushed fragments of statuary that had once depicted Zeus in triumph, Athena in wisdom, Ares in wrath. Now they were rubble beneath his boots. The wind carried no voices, only the hollow sound of emptiness moving through ruins. At the highest terrace where Zeus had pronounced judgments that shaped mortal kingdoms, Kratos stopped. Below stretched what remained of the mortal world. Cities burned in the distance, their smoke adding to the pall that covered the sky. The gods had been tyrants demanding worship and offering only suffering in return. But they had also been the pillars holding reality in place. With them gone, the world sagged toward collapse. Kratos felt no satisfaction in their destruction. Only the familiar weight of ash settling on his shoulders, like a cloak he could never remove. He knelt and gathered a handful of dust that might have been a god or might have been stone. There was no difference now. He placed it carefully atop a larger pile, a cairn without name or purpose. No prayer passed his lips. Prayer was for those who still believed in answers from above. He turned his back on Olympus and began the descent. The Aegean stretched before him, its waters black beneath a sunless sky. Kratos stood on a beach where he had once led Spartan warriors in drills, their shields gleaming in what had been a brighter age. Now the sand held only debris, broken masts from ships that would never sail again, nets tangled with seaweed, and the pale shapes of fish that had washed ashore to die in fouled water. A boat lay capsized near the waterline, its hull split. Footprints in the wet sand suggested survivors. Kratos followed them with his gaze to where a small group huddled near rocks that provided scant shelter from the wind. 3 men, 2 women, a child clutched against its mother's chest. They saw him and froze. The eldest man fell to his knees, hands raised not in defense but in supplication. The gesture made something cold settle in Kratos' chest. "Lord," the man said, his voice breaking, "God of war, we beg, stand." The word cut through the man's plea. Kratos had not raised his voice, but the weight in it made the man's mouth snap shut. The others remained motionless, caught between terror and the awful hope that divine power might still exist to save them. "Stand," Kratos repeated. The man rose on shaking legs. His face was gaunt, marked by hunger and exposure. The others pressed themselves against the rocks, as though they might disappear into stone if they pushed hard enough. Kratos looked at them, at the child whose eyes were too wide and too knowing for its age. He recognized the look. He had seen it in Athens and Sparta, in every city touched by the gods' capricious wrath. It was the expression of those who had learned that power cared nothing for their suffering. He turned and walked away. Behind him, someone called out the word God, carried on desperate breath. The wind took it. Kratos did not look back. He had told them to stand. If they chose to kneel to his absence, that was their failing, not his command. Night found him in a temple that had once honored Athena. Its roof had collapsed, leaving the interior open to the ashen sky. Firelight flickered from deeper within. Kratos moved toward it with the silence of long practice, though he had no intention of hiding his approach. Stealth was for those who feared discovery. He feared nothing here. Survivors had made a camp in what had been the sanctuary, 12 or 13 of them wrapped in whatever cloth they had salvaged. They had built their fire on the altar itself, using sacred wood from the goddess's statue to feed the flames. Kratos approved. Better to burn what had demanded worship than to preserve it for sentiment. They noticed him as he stepped into the firelight. Conversation died. Hands reached for makeshift weapons, broken spears, knives, a length of chain. But they did not attack. Something in his bearing, or perhaps the scars that marked him as one who had survived what should have killed any mortal, made them hesitate. An older woman stood slowly. Her face bore burn scars, the kind left by divine fire when gods grew angry with their worshippers. She studied Kratos with eyes that had seen too much to hold illusions. "We have nothing worth taking," she said. Not a plea, a simple statement of fact. "I take nothing." She nodded as though this confirmed something. Behind her, others shifted nervously. One man, younger and more desperate, pushed forward. "Then you bring help. The gods have sent. The gods are dead." Silence. The words settled over them, like the weight of the ruined roof would have if it still stood above their heads. Some looked relieved. Others began to weep. The young man's face crumpled. "Then what do we pray to?" His voice cracked. "What saves us?" Kratos looked at the makeshift altar they had created in the temple's corner. They had built it from rubble, decorating it with ash they had shaped into crude symbols. At its center sat a piece of red cloth wrapped around something he could not see. The woman noticed his gaze. "We did not know what else to do," she said quietly. "The gods are gone, but you remain. You ended them. You are..." Kratos crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. The survivors scattered, but he ignored them. His hand closed on the altar, and he overturned it with a single motion. Stone cracked against stone. The red cloth fell away, revealing a fragment of armor he recognized as Spartan make. Not his own, but close enough that they had believed it sacred. "No." The word fell into silence. Kratos turned to face them, and they shrank from what they saw in his expression. "Do not pray to me. Do not build altars. Do not make me what I destroyed." A woman holding a child stepped forward, her fear overcome by the desperate need to understand. "If we do not pray, if we have no gods, what remains?" Kratos looked at the child in her arms. Its eyes watched him with the unsettling focus of the very young, who see the world without the blinders of hope or faith. He felt a distant echo of something that might have been sorrow once. Before Olympus. Before the gods had taken everything and left him only rage. "Each other," he said finally. "That is what remains." He left them in the firelight. Behind him, voices rose in confusion and argument. But he had heard one voice speak differently, one that held not worship but thought. Perhaps that would be enough. Perhaps not. He had learned long ago that salvation was not his to give. The ravine opened before him like a wound in the world's skin. Kratos had followed the pull of something he could not name, a sense of wrongness that drew him as surely as a scent draws a predator. The earth here had split, creating a chasm that descended beyond sight. No natural force had carved this. The edges were too clean, too purposeful. He stood at the lip and looked down. Darkness absolute waited below, but it was not empty darkness. Something moved within it. Something watched. Kratos descended into the crack. Handholds appeared where he needed them, as though the stone itself cooperated in his journey toward whatever waited in the depths. The temperature dropped as he climbed down, His breath began to mist strange in air that should have grown warmer with depth. Markings covered the walls. Not Greek, not any language he recognized. They resembled claw marks, but they formed patterns too deliberate to be random damage. When he pressed his palm against one, the stone felt wrong. Too cold, too smooth. Like metal pretending to be rock. A sound reached him from below. Chains dragging across stone metal, scraping metal, in rhythms that reminded him of Athens when he had served the god of war. Of Sparta when he had led armies at Ares' command. The sound should not exist here. These were natural caves untouched by. The thought died as he dropped into a wider chamber and saw what waited. The walls pulsed, not with light, but with something that made light seem like a crude approximation. Colors that had no names moved beneath the surface of stone that was no longer entirely stone. The air tasted of copper and ozone and something else, something his mind refused to categorize, because it had no reference for what it sensed. In the center of the chamber, a shape turned toward him. Not humanoid, not entirely inhuman. It existed in the space between definitions, as though reality had not yet decided what it was permitted to be. Faith. The word emerged from no visible mouth, layered like a dozen voices speaking in unison, but slightly out of phase with each other. Duty. Blood. Kratos drew his weapon. The familiar weight of the blade settled into his hands, grounding him against the wrongness that filled this place. Whatever stood before him, it could bleed. Everything could bleed. I have killed stranger things than you. The shape that was not a shape rippled, as though amused. The walls pulsed faster. The sound of chains grew louder, though Kratos saw nothing that could produce such noise. And beneath it all, almost too quiet to hear, came whispers in languages that should not exist. They spoke of empire and eternity, of faith enforced through fear, of blood spilled to feed machines that ground souls into compliance. The words meant nothing to him, but their intent was clear. This thing, whatever it was, served something vast, something that had noticed him. The wrongness in the air intensified. Kratos felt pressure building like the moment before a storm breaks. The stone beneath his feet began to crack, light bleeding through the fractures in hues that hurt to perceive. The shape reached toward him with appendages that were sometimes hands and sometimes not. Kratos stepped forward to meet it. The chamber exploded. Light became sound, became pressure, became pain. The stone shattered. The walls bent inward, then outward, then simply stopped being walls in any sense that mattered. Kratos felt himself lifted, pulled, torn from the world he knew, and cast into somewhere else. The last thing he heard was the whisper voices now screaming in something that might have been triumph or warning. Then darkness took him, and the darkness had teeth. He fell through spaces that were not space. Colors that were not colors burned against his closed eyelids. Sounds that were not sounds scraped against his mind like claws seeking purchase in stone. Time stretched and compressed and ceased to have meaning. He might have fallen for heartbeats or centuries. Kratos did not scream. He had endured the transformation into a god of war. He had survived the chains that bound him to Ares' service. He had walked through Hades itself and returned. This, whatever this was, would not break him. The sensation of falling changed. Air, if it was air, rushed past him with increasing violence. Temperature spiked, then plunged, then stabilized at something that burned cold against his skin. Light appeared ahead, not the wrong light of the chamber, but something different, harsher, industrial. Kratos struck stone with enough force to crack it. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision, and he forced it back through sheer refusal to surrender to unconsciousness. He lay still for 3 breaths, taking inventory of his body. Bruised but unbroken, battered but functional. He opened his eyes to a ceiling he did not recognize. Stone but worked with tools and purpose he had not seen in Greece. Regular, uniform. The precision of it spoke to builders who valued function over beauty, order over artistry. Dim light came from sources he could not identify, casting shadows that moved wrong. Kratos pushed himself to his feet. His weapons remained with him, strapped to his back where they belonged. Whatever had pulled him from Greece and deposited him here had not disarmed him. That was its first mistake. He stood in a corridor of worked stone. The air smelled of incense and blood, and something underneath both, something chemical and sharp, that reminded him of Greek fire, but more refined, more purposeful. Chains hung from the walls, not restraints but decorations, each link inscribed with symbols that made his eyes hurt to track their patterns. Ahead, light spilled from an opening. With it came sound. Chanting. Hundreds of voices raised in unison, speaking words he did not know, but whose meaning felt horribly familiar. Worship. Submission. The sound of people crushing themselves beneath the weight of something they called holy. Kratos' hands tightened on his weapons. He had left one pantheon as ash. If he had been brought here to witness another, then whoever commanded this place would learn the same lesson Olympus had. He walked toward the light, and the voices ready to teach it again. The chanting led him deeper. Kratos moved through corridors lit by flames that gave no warmth, only a sickly yellow glow that made shadows dance like living things. The walls were worked stone, precise and uniform, in ways that spoke of builders who valued function above beauty. But they had tried for beauty anyway in their fashion. Every surface bore decorations. Skulls carved into cornerstones. Wings and eagles rendered in gold leaf. And bones, human bones, built into the architecture as though the builders believed corpses were acceptable masonry. The smell grew stronger with each step. Incense attempting to mask decay. Blood gone old and sour, and underneath both a chemical sharpness that reminded him of weapons forged in fire and quenched in poison. His hands tightened on the blades of chaos. Whatever waited ahead, it would bleed. Everything bled. The corridor opened into a vast chamber. Kratos stopped at the threshold. Thousands of people packed the space, kneeling in perfect rows on stone worn smooth by generations of knees. They faced a platform at the far end where a statue loomed 3 times the height of a man. Gold plate covered most of its surface, obscuring whatever lay beneath. It sat on a throne, one hand raised in benediction or command, the other holding a sword that pointed toward the ceiling. 2 heads crowned its shoulders, eagles rendered in such detail that their beaks seemed ready to strike. But it was the people that held Kratos' attention. Not their number, though they were many. Not their devotion, though it radiated from them, like heat from a forge. It was the chains. Each person wore manacles connected by lengths of iron that ran from one to the next in an unbroken line. The chains were decorated with symbols made beautiful with engraving and polish. But they were still chains. A figure in red robes stepped onto the platform. His voice carried across the chamber without need for amplification. Trained in projection, or perhaps aided by acoustics, Kratos did not understand. Blessed are we who serve. Blessed are we who kneel. In the name of the God Emperor of mankind, we offer our labor, our faith, our very lives upon his altar. The crowd responded in unison, voices blending into a single thunderous affirmation that made the air itself vibrate. Kratos felt it in his chest, in his bones. Not the force of conviction, but the force of practice, of repetition, ground so deep it had become reflex rather than choice. He had heard such worship before, in Zeus's temples, in Ares's war shrines. Always the same. Demand obedience, call it devotion. Demand sacrifice, call it honor. The faces changed. The words changed. The chains remained. Movement at the chamber's edge caught his eye. Armed men in black armor moved between the rows, watching the worshippers with eyes that never stopped scanning. One of them noticed a woman whose chains had come loose from her neighbors. He struck her with something that crackled with blue lightning. She fell without sound, and no one around her reacted. The man reattached her chain and moved on. Kratos stepped into the chamber. The nearest guard saw him first. His reaction was immediate, trained. The weapon came up barking words that meant nothing to Kratos, but whose tone carried clear meaning. Stop. Identify. Submit. Kratos continued walking. The guard's weapons spoke not with the crack of Greek fire, but with a sharp hiss followed by a beam of red light that burned the air where it passed. It struck Kratos in the shoulder. The impact was negligible, the heat absorbed by skin that had endured the flames of Hades. He did not slow. The guard stumbled backward, training warring with the evidence of his eyes. His weapon should have burned through flesh and bone. Instead, this scarred stranger walked toward him as though he had not fired at all. Halt, the guard managed. In the Emperor's name, I command. Kratos' hand closed on the weapon, crushing its mechanism. Metal screamed. Components fell in pieces to the stone floor. The guard reached for a sidearm, but Kratos was already past him, leaving the man alive but weaponless. He had no interest in killing servants, only in what they served. More guards converged. Their shouts brought others running. The worshippers remained kneeling, heads bowed, though some had begun to look up with expressions caught between terror and something else. Hope, perhaps, or merely confusion at witnessing anyone defy the armed authority they had learned never to question. A volley of red light filled the air. Kratos moved through it, each beam either missing or striking without effect. He had fought gods who threw lightning. These primitive weapons held no threat. When a guard moved to block his path, Kratos swept him aside with minimal force. When another fired from point-blank range, he took the weapon and bent its barrel like soft clay. The priest on the platform had stopped his sermon. His amplified voice cut through the chaos. Heretic, you defile the Emperor's house. Guards, destroy this unclean thing. Kratos reached the base of the platform and looked up at the speaker. The man's face had gone pale beneath his ornate headdress, but his voice remained strong, backed by certainty that had never been tested. You will kneel, the priest declared. All kneel before him. All submit to his divine will. Kratos ascended the steps. Each footfall echoed in the sudden quiet. The guards had ceased firing, perhaps fearing to damage the statue, or perhaps simply frozen by the impossibility of what they witnessed. He reached the top and stood before the priest, close enough to see the man's pupils dilate with fear. I do not kneel. The words fell like stones into still water. Ripples spread outward. In the crowd, someone gasped. Another whispered something that might have been a prayer, or might have been a curse. The priest's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before his training reasserted itself. Then you will be cast down. The Emperor's wrath. Gods. Kratos said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the acoustics of the chamber. Always speak through servants. always demand submission, always threaten those who refuse. He turned to look at the golden statue at its raised hand and pointed sword. I have met such gods. I have seen their works. They take everything and give nothing but promises of glory after death. Blasphemy. The priest's face had gone from pale to flushed red spreading up from his collar. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. Without him, we are nothing. Kratos' gaze swept across the kneeling masses across their chains, and bowed heads and faces, marked by exhaustion, dressed up as devotion. He saw children among them, too young to know anything but submission. He saw old ones who had known nothing else their entire lives. And he saw the guards themselves wearing chains beneath their armor, though theirs were made of oaths rather than iron. You are not nothing. He spoke not to the priest, but to those who knelt. You were not nothing before gods demanded you believe it. A woman in the front row looked up. Her face bore scars from the same blue lightning weapons the guards carried. She met Kratos' eyes for a heartbeat, and in that moment he saw something that made his hands tighten on his weapons. Not hope, not worship, just a question she had perhaps never been permitted to ask. The priest gestured frantically, and the guards opened fire in earnest. This time they did not care about damaging the platform or the statue. Mass destruction was preferable to allowing this heretic to continue speaking. The air became solid with red light. Kratos moved. He was among them before they could adjust their aim. The first guard fell with his weapons shattered. The second found himself disarmed and cast aside. Kratos fought with brutal efficiency, not to kill, but to stop, to disable, to remove the threat without creating more bodies for the priest to call martyrs. But some fell regardless. When cornered men fight without skill, they die to their own desperation. Blood spread across the platform. The priest screamed for reinforcements, and in the crowd, the chains began to rattle, not with fear, with something else. A man in the third row stood. His chains pulled taut, yanking his neighbors, but he did not sit. He simply stood staring at the impossible scene before him. Then another rose, and another. Not rebellion, not yet. Just the simple act of standing when everything in their lives had taught them to kneel. The priest's voice rose to a shriek. Kneel! The Emperor commands it. Kneel before his glory. Kratos broke the last guard's weapon and turned to face the statue. Up close, he could see the joins where gold leaf had been applied over something older. Something that had perhaps once been different before being repurposed for this new god's worship. He had seen the same thing in Athens, where temples to older deities had been stripped and remade for the Olympians. He struck the statue at its base. The golden surface cracked. Beneath he glimpsed wood, old wood rotten in places, held together more by gold and faith than by structural integrity. He struck again, and the statue's sword arm fell crashing to the platform with a sound like thunder. The priest lunged at him, screaming incoherently. Kratos caught him by the throat, lifting him easily. The man's hands scrabbled at Kratos' arm, finding purchase only on scars that had survived worse attempts. Listen, Kratos said, voice level despite the chaos erupting around them. Your god sits on gold and accepts chains. That is all I need to know. He released the priest, who collapsed, gasping. Then Kratos turned to face the crowd. More had stood now, not all, not even half, but enough that the sound of their rising was like distant thunder building toward a storm. Stand or kneel, he told them. The choice is yours, but do not make gods of those who demand. You have no choice. He did not wait to see their response. He had learned in Greece that some would always choose. Their chains would call them comfort or duty or divine will. He could not save people from themselves. He could only refuse to be the thing they made into their new master. Kratos descended from the platform and walked toward the chamber's far exit. Guards moved to block him, but their hearts were not in it. They had watched him shatter their weapons like pottery. Some stood aside without being asked. Others simply watched him pass expressions unreadable behind their face-concealing helmets. Behind him, the priest's voice rose again, calling for order, demanding obedience, threatening consequences, both temporal and eternal. But Kratos also heard other sounds, chains clinking as people tested them, voices murmuring questions, the crack of gold leaf falling from a statue whose arm lay broken on the platform. He passed through the exit into another corridor, leaving the chamber and its aftermath behind. Wherever he was, whoever had built this place, they had created Olympus anew. Different names, different symbols, same chains. He would break them the same way. 9. The corridor led to a plaza open to sky that was wrong. Kratos stopped at the threshold, studying what lay beyond. The sky was gray, but not with natural clouds. It moved with a regularity that suggested machinery or something else artificial. The air tasted of ash and chemicals. In the distance, massive structures rose like mountains, but they were too regular, too deliberately shaped. More architecture on a scale that dwarfed anything he had seen in Greece. The plaza itself teemed with people. Not kneeling this time, but moving in organized streams from one point to another, herded by guards who directed traffic with weapons and shouted commands. Lines formed at stations where robed figures inspected papers or marked foreheads with stamps that glowed briefly before fading. Those who passed moved on. Those who failed were pulled aside, and Kratos saw where they went. A structure at the plaza's edge swallowed them. He could not see what happened inside, but he heard screams, not of pain, though that was present. Screams of loss of separation, families torn apart, children taken from parents, the old separated from those who might have cared for them. And through it all, that same chanting. Not from these people, but from speakers mounted on poles, voices reciting the same litanies he had heard in the chamber. Blessed are we who serve. Blessed are we who kneel. A woman broke from her line, running toward a child being dragged away by guards. She screamed a name, reaching desperate. A guard struck her with his crackling weapon. She fell. No one helped her rise. The line closed the gap her absence created and moved on. Kratos' jaw tightened. His hands found his weapons without conscious thought. A voice spoke behind him, not raised, but carrying authority nonetheless. Impressive display in the cathedral. He turned. A woman stood in the corridor's shadows, her armor different from the guards. Red where theirs was black, more ornate, marked with symbols that suggested rank or purpose. Her face was hard-carved by experience into an expression of permanent readiness for violence. But her eyes held something more. Assessment, certainly. But also doubt. You killed 3 of my sisters, she continued, moving into the light. Wounded 7 more, yet you walked through last fire as though it were rain. She paused, head tilting slightly. What are you? Nothing that concerns you. Everything in this shrine concerns me. I am Canoness Lyra of the Orders Militant. This world is under my protection. Kratos looked past her to the plaza, to the woman lying where she had fallen, to the child still screaming for its mother. Your protection looks like chains. Order requires discipline. Discipline requires sacrifice. The words came easily rehearsed. But something in her tone suggested she had said them so often they had worn smooth, lost whatever edge they might once have held. And who decides what must be sacrificed? The Emperor's will interpreted by those he has chosen to, Servants, Kratos interrupted. Gods always speak through servants, always claim their cruelty as divine necessity. He met her eyes. I have heard these words before, in different tongues from different thrones. The blood still smells the same. Lyra's hand moved to her weapon, not drawing, but ready. You speak heresy. I should execute you where you stand. Then do it. She did not move. The moment stretched tension building like a storm about to break. Then she spoke, voice lower, meant only for him. That woman in the plaza. She had insufficient prayer documentation. The child was being transferred to scholastic training where it will serve the emperor better than with parents too poor to educate it properly. This is order. This is how billions survive in a galaxy that wants to devour them. And if they chose differently, then they would die, or worse. Lyra's expression hardened. You speak from ignorance. This galaxy does not permit the luxury of choice. There are things in the darkness that would feast on souls given the chance. The Emperor's light is harsh because anything less would be consumed. Kratos looked at her, at the certainty that armored her more thoroughly than the red plate she wore. He recognized it. He had worn such certainty once when Ares had promised him victory in exchange for service. When Zeus had claimed his tyranny was justice. When every god of Olympus had justified their cruelty with necessity. There are always things in the darkness, he said quietly. Gods use them to justify chains. Tell the weak they need protection only the divine can provide. Create the very threats they claim to guard against. You know nothing of what we face. I know gods. I know what they take and what they call it. He turned away from her, looking back at the plaza. Your emperor sits on gold, while children are torn from mothers. That is all I need to know. He sits on a throne that holds back the darkness itself. Without him, without his sacrifice, humanity would have been extinct 10,000 years ago. The passion in her voice was real. Kratos recognized it too. The desperate need to believe suffering had purpose, that the chains were necessary, that somewhere in all the blood and ash there was meaning. He had believed such things once. Then he had met the gods who claimed to provide that meaning, and he had seen their true faces. 10,000 years, he repeated. And in all that time has he freed anyone? Has this protection done anything but demand more chains, more sacrifice, more worship? He looked at her directly. Or does it simply perpetuate itself, feeding on what it claims to save? Lyra's weapon came out now, an ornate bolt pistol that she aimed with steady hands. I will not debate theology with a heretic. Surrender or die. Kratos did not move toward his weapons. I do not surrender. I do not serve. If you mean to kill me, then do so. But know that I have heard your arguments before in different words from different faithful servants. They all believed they had no choice. They all believed their gods were necessary. And what happened to them? They were wrong. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. Then from the plaza, a new sound rose. Not screams this time, but something worse. Laughter. High and wrong, layered like multiple voices speaking in harmony that should not harmonize. The air temperature dropped suddenly sharp enough that Kratos saw his breath mist. Lyra's weapon shifted away from him toward the plaza. Her expression changed, fear replacing conviction. No. Not here. Not now. The speakers mounted on poles began to shriek, no longer chanting, but wailing like wounded animals. The gray sky rippled colors bleeding through that should not exist in nature, and in the plaza's center, the stone cracked. Something was coming through, Kratos' hands found his weapons. Whatever arrived, god or demon or some new horror, this reality had birthed, it would bleed. Everything bled. Lyra was already moving shouting orders into a device at her wrist. All units, demonic incursion in Processing Plaza 7. Lock down the cathedral, mobilize the Jasamers. The stone exploded upward. What emerged was not solid, not entirely. It flickered between states, sometimes flesh, and sometimes light, and sometimes neither. Multiple limbs that ended in too many joints. A face that might have been beautiful if beauty could exist in wrongness. And eyes, so many eyes, all of them focusing on Kratos with recognition that should not have been possible. It spoke in that layered voice, words overlapping until they became something that bypassed ears and resonated directly in the skull. God Killer. We have felt your touch before. Different pantheons, different prisons, always the same refusal. The thing that was not entirely a thing tilted what might have been its head. But here in this reality we offer what they could not. Freedom from consequence. Power without price. Kneel to us and we will give you what you have always sought. I seek nothing from gods. Not gods. Us. We are what comes after gods, what feeds on their remains. The demon's form rippled with colors that had no names. The boy you could not save. The wife whose death you carry like armor. We can erase it all. Make you forget. Is that not what you truly want? Kratos felt ice settle in his chest. Not fear. Something colder. This thing knew. It had looked inside him and seen the scars that ran deeper than those marking his flesh. I do not want to forget. Then we offer pain eternal. We offer the certainty that your suffering matters, that every death you carry means something in the grand design. Is that not better than the emptiness you fear? No. The demon's laughter returned wrong harmonics that made the air vibrate. You refuse both comfort and purpose. What then do you accept? Kratos' answer came not in words, but in motion. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, blades already swinging. The demon met him with appendages that were sometimes solid enough to parry, and sometimes not. Where his blades passed through reality, screamed. Lyra's bolt pistol spoke mass reactive shells, detonating against the demon's flesh with tremendous force. The creature barely noticed. It was focused entirely on Kratos, on studying him, with those too many eyes, even as it defended against his assault. Fascinating, it said even while being carved apart. You damage us without sanctification, without faith to armor your soul. How do you survive proximity to truth, unfiltered by belief? Kratos did not answer. He had learned long ago that gods and their servants loved to talk, to explain, to justify. He had learned that their words were weapons designed to make prey, doubt, question, hesitate. So he did not speak. He simply cut. The demon's form began to destabilize. Lyra had been joined by more armored women, their weapons pouring fire into the incursion point. But it was Kratos' blades that were forcing it back each strike, not just damaging, but somehow severing whatever tether kept it anchored in this reality. We shall return, the demon promised, its voice fading even as new ones emerged in the plaza. We always return, and when we do, we will show you what becomes of those who refuse every offered hand. Then it was gone, dissolved back into whatever place such things dwelled. But the incursion continued. More entities poured through the crack in the stone, these smaller, but no less wrong. They fell upon the trapped people in the plaza like predators who had just discovered prey that could not run. Kratos moved among them. He killed with the same efficiency he had shown the guards. But these things died differently. When his blades cut demon flesh, it burned not with fire but with absence, as though his weapons carved holes in reality itself. The entities screamed as they were unmade, their voices joining the cacophony that had turned the plaza into a vision of controlled damnation, becoming uncontrolled hell. Beside him, Lyra fought with prayer and bolt pistol both. Her sisters formed a defensive line, chanting in unison as they fired. Whatever power their faith granted them, it was real. The demons flinched from their words as much as from their weapons. But the people, the trapped, herded people with their chains and their exhaustion and their complete lack of preparation for horror beyond human comprehension. They broke. They ran. They died in the chaos, trampled or torn apart, or simply frozen by terror until something hungry found them. Kratos saw a child fall. He moved without thought blade, intercepting the demon that had lunged for it. The thing dissipated, and he lifted the child small and light and set it behind him. Found its mother in the chaos and pushed them both toward Lyra's defensive line. "Get them out," he commanded. Lyra stared at him, this heretic who had just saved a life, while killing demons, without prayer or faith. "Who are you?" Someone who has seen this before. He turned back to the fight, to the endless stream of entities that kept coming through the crack. "Close that wound. I will hold them." She wanted to refuse. He saw it in her face. But pragmatism won over doctrine. "Fall back," she ordered her sisters. "Civilian evacuation priority form on me." They obeyed with practiced discipline, creating a corridor through which the trapped people could flee. Some made it, some did not. Kratos stood at the choke point where the demons emerged, and he became the wall that stopped them from spreading further. It was not heroism. He felt no nobility in the act. He simply recognized the pattern trapped people in different gods, servants who spoke of necessity while blood flowed. He had seen it in Athens, in Sparta, in every city touched by divine whim. The details changed. The suffering remained. So he did what he had always done. He killed the monsters, whatever form they wore. The last demon fell as the crack sealed itself, whatever force that had torn reality closing it again. Kratos stood in the center of a plaza, now empty save for bodies and blood, and the woman who had fallen earlier still lying where she had been struck. He walked to her, knelt, confirmed what he already knew. Dead. Struck down for loving her child too much to let it be taken. "The Emperor protects," he said quietly, bitterly, the words tasting like ash. Behind him, footsteps approached. Lyra, her armor scarred by demon claw, her face pale beneath her helmet. She looked at the dead woman, then at Kratos. "You saved them." "Not her. Not those." He gestured at the bodies scattered across the plaza. "Your protection comes too late for too many. Without order, more would have died. The incursion would have spread. You saw what came through that wound. These people cannot fight such things. They need not to be bait." Kratos stood towering over her despite her armor. "You gather them like cattle. Chain them, process them, offer them to whatever comes hunting. Then call survival a blessing, when some live through what should never have threatened them in the first place. You do not understand the galaxy we inhabit. I understand gods. I understand servants who justify what they must do to survive them. I understand that both create the very hells they claim to prevent." Lyra's hand moved to her weapon, then away. She was tired, he realized. Not physically, though, the fight had exhausted her. Tired in the way that came from years of performing duty, while doubt ate at conviction from within. If not the Emperor's way, then what? What alternative exists that does not end in extinction? It was the question he had heard before in different forms, from different faithful servants throughout Greek mythology. What happens when the gods fall? What fills the void their absence creates? He had no answer that would satisfy her. He had barely believed his own answer when he had given it in the temple ruins. "Each other," he said finally. "That is all anyone ever has." Insufficient. But her voice lacked conviction. She looked again at the dead woman, at the child that had been saved at the plaza, where daemons had emerged from belief, made manifest. If faith cannot protect them, if the Emperor's light does not suffice, then what defense remains against the darkness? Kratos sheathed his blades. The same defense that has always existed. The refusal to kneel. The refusal to let gods define the worth of lives they do not live. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "They will come for you. The Inquisition, the Grey Knights, forces you cannot comprehend wielding powers you cannot resist. They will not stop until you are dead or bound to serve. Then they will fail, as all who tried before them. You do not know what you face." He looked back at her, this armored woman who killed demons with prayer, and wondered if protection was another word for prison. "No, but you do not know what I have already destroyed." Kratos left her in the plaza, surrounded by the dead her protection had not saved. Behind him he heard her speak quietly, perhaps to herself, or perhaps to whatever god she still believed might listen. "Emperor, preserve us from heretics, from demons." A pause. "From questions we cannot answer." He did not look back. Questions were good. Questions meant the chains had loosened, even if only slightly. That was all he had achieved in Greece, in the end. Not salvation. Just the space for people to ask if salvation was possible without gods. It would have to be enough. The sky tore. Not metaphorically. Kratos watched reality split like cloth, the gray artificial ceiling peeling back to reveal something beyond that made his eyes hurt to perceive directly. Colors that should not exist bled through the wound, and from it descended something vast. Ships, if they could be called that. Massive beyond scale, their hulls covered in gothic architecture that served no function he could identify. They moved with ponderous grace, and from their bellies, smaller craft erupted like insects from a disturbed nest. One descended toward the plaza where he stood. It was angular, brutal, its design suggesting a mind that thought only in terms of force and function. It landed with a sound like thunder metal feet crushing stone, and a ramp descended. What emerged were giants, not gods. Kratos had met gods. These were something else. Men in armor so massive it made the guards look like children. They moved with precision that should have been impossible in such bulk weapons, held ready every gesture, speaking of discipline that had transcended training to become instinct. 7 of them. They formed a line between him and any exit, and when they stopped moving, the very air seemed to still around them. One stepped forward. Taller than the others, his armor marked with more ornamentation, though still fundamentally practical. When he spoke, his voice was amplified by the helmet, making each word feel like a physical thing. "Anomaly. You will identify yourself." Kratos said nothing. "Your arrival has disrupted this world's function. You have killed Imperial servants. You have interfered with sacred rites. You have survived contact with the Neverborn without sanction or protection. The giant's helmet turned slightly, lenses focusing. What are you? A man. Insufficient. Men die to lost fire. Men fall to demon claw. Men do not walk through our weapons as though they were rain. Kratos studied them. These armored giants who stood like a wall between him and whatever they protected. They reminded him of the warriors in Zeus's service, those who had been given divine gifts and told to believe themselves blessed rather than enslaved. Your names do not matter to me, he said. Your purpose is clear enough. You serve. You protect the chains you call order. You kill what questions. We are the Emperor's finest. The Grey Knight's demon hunters, truth bearers. The speaker's voice held no anger, just cold certainty. And we have been sent to determine if you are threat or tool. I am neither. Unacceptable. All things serve or are destroyed. Those are the only categories that matter in this galaxy. Kratos' hands moved to his weapons, not drawing, but ready. I have met many who claimed there were only two choices. They were always the ones offering chains and calling them necessity. The Grey Knight who had spoken, their leader Kratos, assumed did not react to the movement. But the others shifted slightly weapons, adjusting to maintain coverage. These were warriors who had fought together until each knew the other's movements without need for command. Brother Captain Severin, a voice crackled from a device at the leader's belt. The Inquisitor requests immediate containment. Civilian witnesses must be minimized. Severin did not look away from Kratos. Acknowledged. Lockdown protocols initiated. Around the plaza, blast doors began to descend, sealing exits. The few remaining civilians who had not yet fled found themselves trapped. Kratos saw them press against the doors, hammering uselessly, their voices rising in panic. You trap them with me. Kratos' voice remained level, but something in his posture shifted. With what you believe is a threat, they are acceptable losses if it ensures containment. Severin's tone suggested he was stating simple fact rather than passing judgment. The Inquisition will determine what can be saved. Acceptable losses. Kratos had heard such phrases before, always from those who would never be among the losses they deemed acceptable. You speak like gods, claim necessity, demand sacrifice from others. We are not gods. We are their servants, executing their will. Then you are worse. Gods can claim ignorance of mortal pain. Servants know and choose to inflict it anyway. For the first time, Severin's voice changed, taking on an edge that might have been anger or might have been something colder. You comprehend nothing. You are an outsider, a fragment of something that does not belong in this reality. We exist because we must. We kill because if we do not, the entire species falls to corruption beyond imagining. I have imagined much. Kratos' grip tightened on his weapons. I have seen corruption wearing crowns and calling itself divine right. I have watched servants justify slaughter because their masters demanded it. The words change. The chains remain. Final offer anomaly. Surrender. Allow us to transport you for examination. If you prove uncorrupted, you may even serve. I do not serve. Then you will be destroyed. The Grey Knights moved as one weapons rising. Kratos saw the calculation in their formation, the way they positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining spacing that prevented a single enemy from engaging more than two at once. These were not the fumbling guards from the cathedral. These were warriors who had fought things beyond mortal comprehension and developed doctrine from survival. Kratos moved first. He closed the distance to the nearest knight before the giant could fully adjust his aim. Up close, he saw the details the armor hid. Not machine, but something that had been a man once transformed by augmentation into something more and less than human. The blade in the knight's hand glowed with energies that felt wrong against Kratos' senses, but wrong in a different way than the demons had felt. This was order imposed on chaos structure forced onto the formless. Their weapons met. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the plaza, cracking stone that had withstood demon incursion. The Grey Knight held, which spoke to strength beyond anything natural. But Kratos had fought the strong before. Strength alone was never enough. He shifted angles using the knight's own force against him, and struck at joints where armor plating had to flex. His blade found purchase scoring marks in metal that should not have marked. The knight stumbled back, and Kratos pressed. The others opened fire. Not lass weapons, but something that screamed through the air with psychic force, as well as physical. Each round was a minor apocalypse, designed to unmake demon flesh through both material and immaterial assault. They struck Kratos like hammer blows, each one driving him back a step. But they did not unmake him. Whatever power they called upon, whatever faith armored these rounds, Kratos was not demon. He was simply a man who had survived worse. He grabbed a chunk of rubble and hurled it with enough force to crack one knight's helmet. Dove under a blade that would have taken his head. Rolled past another's attempt to grab him in powered gauntlets that could crush stone. He fought as he had always fought, not with honor or technique, but with brutal efficiency born from killing things that should have been unkillable. Severin spoke a word, and the air itself became a weapon. Pressure descended on Kratos like the weight of a mountain. He felt it crushing him, forcing him down, compelling his knees to bend. This was not physical strength. This was will made manifest, faith given. Formed the belief that their cause was so righteous that reality itself would bend to enforce it. Kratos had felt such pressure before. When Zeus had commanded him to serve. When Ares had demanded worship. When every god of Olympus had tried to make him kneel. He had refused then. He refused now. The pressure shattered against his will, not through faith or power of his own, but through simple, absolute rejection. He would not kneel. That was not negotiable. Severin actually stepped back. Through the helmet, Kratos saw eyes widen fractionally. These warriors had fought demons, and worse, had seen horrors beyond counting. But they had never met a mortal who could resist psychic pressure through sheer refusal to submit. Impossible, Severin breathed. You have no psychic defenses, no sanctified protection. By what mechanism, Kratos did not explain. He simply acted. A grenade appeared in his hand, taken from a fallen guard earlier. He did not know its mechanism, but he knew explosive devices. He triggered it and threw it into the center of the Grey Knight's formation. The blast was less powerful than he had hoped, but sufficient to disrupt their coordination. In that moment of chaos, he moved. Not to attack them further, but to reach the sealed blast doors where civilians still hammered uselessly. His blade struck the door's mechanism, once, twice. On the third strike, something crucial broke, and the door began to rise. Not quickly enough. The trapped people had to crawl under, squeezing through a gap barely large enough, but they could escape. That was what mattered. Go, he commanded. And they went, not questioning, not hesitating, just fleeing from the nightmare their protective plaza had become. Severin's voice cut through the confusion. Target is prioritizing civilian escape. Reform and contain before. The sentence died as Kratos turned not toward the Grey Knights, but toward the plaza's far wall. He had fought enough battles to read terrain to know when a position could be held and when survival meant retreat. This was the latter. He ran. Not in fear, but in cold calculation. The Grey Knights would pursue, but their armor slowed them despite its strength. And he knew cities knew how to lose hunters in urban environments. Whether this massive structure counted as a city by his understanding did not matter. The principles remained. Behind him, Severin's voice echoed across the plaza. All units' target is evading. Quarantine the sector. He cannot be allowed to remain free. Kratos disappeared into the labyrinthine structures, leaving the Grey Knights and their certainty behind. But he had learned things from the encounter. This Imperium commanded forces beyond what he had faced in the cathedral. They had warriors who could resist even his strength weapons that struck at more than flesh. And perhaps most dangerous, the absolute conviction that their cruelty was necessity. He had fought such conviction before. He would fight it again. And he would break it as he had broken Olympus. The sky above continued to bleed those impossible colors, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled. That was not weather, but the sound of more ships descending. The Imperium was bringing force to bear. They would hunt him with increasing resources until either he fell, or they learned what he had spent millennia teaching gods. Some things could not be chained, some wills could not be broken, and some refusals were absolute. Kratos vanished into the depths of the structure they called a shrine world, leaving behind questions the Imperium could not answer, and civilians who had seen a man defy what they had been taught was absolute authority. Whether that would help them or doom them, he did not know. He had learned in Greece that liberation often looked like chaos to those who had known only chains. But the alternative was to let the chains remain, and that Kratos would never accept. The lower district stank of more than decay. Kratos moved through corridors where the walls wept moisture that was not water. The architecture here had given up pretense of grandeur. These were functional spaces built to house bodies and extract labor with minimum waste of materials. Pipes ran exposed across ceilings, dripping fluids in hues that suggested industrial runoff mixed with something organic. The dim light came from strips that flickered their mechanisms, failing without replacement. He had been descending for hours. Each level brought him deeper into the structure's bowels, away from the ordered brutality of the cathedral and plaza, towards something rawer. The people here did not kneel in organized rows. They huddled in alcoves, pressed against walls, their eyes hollow with the exhaustion that came from simply existing day to day. Some watched him pass. Most did not. He was just another anomaly in a place where survival depended on not noticing things that might draw unwanted attention. The smell changed. Beneath the decay and chemicals, he caught something familiar. Blood, fresh and abundant, and smoke that carried the odor of burned flesh mixed with incense. Ritual sacrifice. He had smelled it too many times not to recognize the signature. Kratos followed the scent. The corridor opened into a larger space, perhaps once a warehouse or processing center for whatever industry had operated here. Now it served darker purpose. The floor had been cleared of machinery, leaving only rust-stained metal plates marked with symbols he recognized from the plaza's demon incursion. Crude circles and angular runes drawn in substances that gleamed wetly in the failing light. Bodies lay in arrangements that suggested ceremony rather than combat. Their throats had been opened with precision, blood channeled into grooves cut into the floor. At the center stood figures in robes bearing the same symbols, their chanting a discordant drone that made the air feel thick. Kratos counted them. 12 cultists, one leader elevated on a platform made from corpses stacked like building blocks. And at the ritual's heart, a wound in reality trying to tear itself wider. Not fully open yet, but the edges flickered with that wrong light he had seen when the demons emerged in the plaza. He stepped into the chamber. The chanting faltered. Heads turned, eyes widening with surprise that transformed quickly into religious fervor when they saw not Grey Knights or inquisitorial troops, but a single man. A witness. The leader's voice carried artificial resonance aided by something that distorted the sound into painful frequencies. The blood god sends us an offering. The cultists drew weapons. Not the refined las guns of the guards above, but crude implements. Sharpened metal industrial tools repurposed for violence, objects whose only sophistication was their capacity to inflict suffering. They charged. Kratos met them without ceremony. His blades found throats and hearts with practiced efficiency. These were not warriors. They were zealots drunk on promises of power and immortality that gods always offered and never delivered. Their fervor made them dangerous only to the unprepared. The first died before his battle cry finished. The second fell with her weapon still rising. The third managed to swing his sharpened pipe, but Kratos had already moved, and the blow struck only air before the return stroke opened the cultist from shoulder to hip. Blood spattered the ritual circles, disrupting the careful patterns. The wound in reality flickered its edges, becoming less stable. Good. Whatever they were calling through deserved to stay on the other side. The leader shrieked commands from his corpse platform. But his remaining cultists were already fleeing their faith insufficient to overcome the reality of watching their fellows butchered by someone who moved through violence like a craftsman through familiar work. Kratos ascended the platform. The leader fumbled with something at his belt, producing a blade that glowed with energy similar to the Grey Knight's weapons. Psychic power, perhaps, or some darker blessing from the entities he served. "You dare interrupt the great work." Spittle flew from the leader's lips. "The blood god hungers, he must be fed. Then feed him yourself." Kratos caught the descending blade between his palms. The psychic energy sparked and hissed against his skin, trying to sever flesh that had endured worse. He twisted, breaking the weapon in half, then drove both pieces into the leader's chest. The man's eyes widened. Not with pain, but with ecstasy. "Yes," he breathed. "Yes, the blood god accepts. He welcomes he." Kratos snapped his neck before he could finish. Whatever god the cultist worshipped would have to find satisfaction elsewhere. The wound in reality pulsed once, twice, since then began to contract. Without the ritual's sustaining power, it lost cohesion. Kratos watched it shrink until only a scar remained, a place where the barrier between worlds had been scratched but not broken. He turned to leave, then stopped. The scar was expanding again. Not gradually, not through resumed ritual, but explosively, as though something on the other side had decided the door was close enough and forced the rest open through sheer will. The metal floor buckled. Temperature spiked high enough to make the air shimmer, and through the wound stepped something that should not fit through a space so small. It had to crouch to enter its horns, scraping the ceiling 20 feet above. Brass armor covered skin the color of dried blood. Wings spread wide enough to touch both walls despite the chamber's size. And in its hands, an axe that thrummed with power that bypassed the eyes and resonated directly in the bone. A demon, greater than those in the plaza. Kratos recognized the category, if not the specific type. This was not a scout or a servant. This was a general, a champion, something that gods unleashed when they wanted entire cities burned. It looked at him, eyes like furnaces behind a helm fashioned from skulls that still screamed despite being long dead. When it spoke, the words came layered with other voices, as though entire legions spoke through one throat. Godslayer. The word carried recognition that should not have been possible. This thing knew him. Not his face or his history, but something deeper. It knew what he was. Khorne has felt your touch across realities. Pantheons shattered. Divine blood spilled. The brass throne hungers for one who would sit among the skulls willingly. Kratos drew his weapons. I do not sit on thrones. Then you will kneel before them. The demon moved. Something that size should not move so fast, but speed was not governed by mass when will itself became the driving force. Its axe descended in an arc designed to split Kratos from crown to groin power, crackling along the blade's edge with energies that would unmake flesh and scatter the resulting pieces across dimensions. Kratos rolled beneath the strike. The axe bit into metal flooring, shearing through it like parchment. Molten slag erupted from the wound, spraying across the chamber. Kratos came up behind the demon blades, already swinging toward the joints in its armor, where brass plates had to flex. Steel met divine flesh. The blades of chaos forged in Greek hell and bound to him through suffering, bit deep. The demon roared not in pain, but in something approaching satisfaction. Yes, blood flows, skulls will be taken. This is worthy combat. It spun faster than something so massive should spin wings, spreading to catch Kratos in their sweep. He dropped flat, felt the wingtips pass close enough to stir his hair, then launched himself at the demon's chest. His shoulder drove into brass armor with force that would have caved in a mortal ribcage. The demon stumbled back a step. Just one, but it was enough. Kratos had learned long ago that even the mightiest could be moved if you found the right leverage point. The demon's size was strength, but also vulnerability. Too much mass took time to redirect. He pressed the advantage blades, working in patterns he had perfected across centuries of killing things that should not die. Strike the joints, hamstring when possible, blind if opportunity presented. The specific anatomy changed, but the principles remained. The demon bled. Not blood as mortals understood it, but something that burned where it touched metal, eating through the floor in hissing puddles. Its roars shook the chamber, bringing down sections of ceiling. But it was bleeding, and that meant it could die. You fight well. The demon's voice held approval despite the damage Kratos was inflicting. Khorne offers you eternity. Power without end. Battles that never cease against foes forever worthy. Kneel, and these gifts are yours. Kratos answered with his blades carving another chunk from the demon's thigh. The thing staggered its leg, nearly buckling, but it laughed. The sound was wrong, layered with harmonics that suggested the laughter came from somewhere beyond this chamber, echoing from a throne made of weapons and watered with blood. Refusal is also combat. Khorne accepts all answers. Serve or resist, both spill blood. Both add skulls to the throne. Then your god is a fool. Khorne is not God. Khorne is war itself. War given will. War that feeds on all who fight regardless of purpose or allegiance. The demon's axe came around in a horizontal sweep that would have split the chamber in half if Kratos had not dropped to the floor. The blade passed overhead, and in that moment of overextension, Kratos saw his opening. He drove both blades into the demon's foot, pinning it to the floor, then wrenched sideways with all his strength. The demon toppled. It crashed like a collapsing tower, brass armor clanging against metal flooring hard enough to shake the entire level. Kratos was on it instantly, blades seeking the gaps in its helm, where molten eyes burned with eternal hunger for violence. The demon caught him. Massive hands closed around his torso, lifting him away from its vulnerable points, crushing with pressure that would have turned stone to powder. Kratos felt ribs protest, but he had endured Hades' grip. Poseidon's crushing depths, Zeus's attempt to squeeze the life from him. Pain was familiar territory. He drove his knee into the demon's wrist joint, once, twice again, until bones that were not quite bones cracked. The grip loosened fractionally enough to twist to get leverage to slam his head forward into the demon's helm with force that sent shockwaves through both their skulls. The demon dropped him. Kratos landed hard but rolled, came up already moving as the demon surged to its feet with impossible speed. They clashed again, blade meeting us, in exchanges that sent sparks flying and carved deeper wounds into both combatants. But Kratos had fought gods. He knew the pattern. Bleed them enough, damage them sufficiently, and they withdrew. Not from fear, gods knew nothing of fear, but from pragmatism. Even divine flesh required time to regenerate when properly shredded. The demon's attacks grew wider, less precise. Its left leg dragged where Kratos had severed tendons. One wing hung useless, its structure compromised by repeated strikes. And still it fought, because that was its nature. It existed to fight. Everything else was just waiting for the next battle. You cannot kill me, God Slayer. I am Karzul, herald of the brass throne. I have fallen before and risen again. I will fall here and rise again. This is not defeat. This is merely practice. Then practice dying. Kratos' blades found the demon's throat. Both hands drove the weapons deep, crossing them, then tearing outward in opposite directions. The demon's head came half off, hanging at an angle that would have been fatal for anything mortal. Karzul laughed, even as its form began to destabilize. The brass armor lost cohesion, becoming smoke that stank of burned sacrifice. The massive body collapsed inward, shrinking, folding back through the wound, in reality that had birthed it. We will meet again, the demon promised as it dissolved. Korn's gaze has found you. The blood god does not look away. I will return. I always return. Then it was gone, leaving only scorch marks where it had stood and the lingering smell of brass heated beyond endurance. Kratos stood in the aftermath, breathing hard. Not from exhaustion, the fight had been brutal, but brief, but from the recognition of what he had just learned. In Greece, when he killed a god, it stayed dead. When he banished a demon, it found other heroes to torment. But this thing claimed it would return, not metaphorically. Actually return to this same fight against this same opponent. Eternal war. Not as poetic description, but as literal reality. A cosmos where killing your enemies was merely temporary, where victory bought only respite until the next battle. He understood now why the Grey Knights fought with such grim determination. Why the Imperium preached that there is only war. In a reality where the defeated simply regenerated and returned peace was not achievable. Only endless combat. Kratos looked at the bodies scattered across the ritual chamber. The cultists who had died believing their god would reward them. The leader who had achieved ecstasy in death. All of them feeding a cycle that could not be broken by any amount of bloodshed, because bloodshed itself was the god's sustenance. He had escaped one Olympus, only to find another, writ larger and more honest about its demands. Zeus had at least pretended to offer something beyond endless service. This blood god made no such pretense. It was war without purpose, violence without goal, killing forever. Because killing was all there was. Kratos sheathed his blades and began climbing back toward the upper levels. He needed to understand this reality better. needed to know if there was any way to end what seemed designed to be unending. Behind him, the wound in reality pulsed once more, not opening but throbbing like a fresh scar. Karzul would return. The demon had been honest about that much. Everything here returned. Nothing stayed dead. For the first time since arriving in this place, Kratos felt something close to despair. In Greece, his war had ended when the gods fell. Here, the war had no ending, only participants. Santanshi, he emerged into a level that buzzed with activity. Not the ordered movement of the cathedral or the desperate huddles of the lower districts. This was organized chaos, people moving with purpose through spaces that hummed with machinery. Kratos stopped a woman carrying supplies. She flinched, but did not run when he spoke. "What is this place?" She looked at him warily, taking in his appearance scarred, covered in demon blood that still smoked where it had splattered his skin, weapons that dripped fluids that ate into the floor. "Medical district," she managed. "We treat workers injured in the processing centers. Why do you—" An alarm cut through her question. Not the shrill wailing that had announced demon incursions, but a steady tolling that spoke of something more organized, more deliberate. The woman's face went pale. "Oh no, not again." "What? The hymns?" She pointed toward speakers mounted on walls. "They're calling everyone to the plaza. When they call everyone." She did not finish. She just ran. Kratos followed. The plaza was the same one where he had fought diamonds, though someone had made efforts to clean it. The bodies were gone. The blood had been washed away, those stains remained where it had eaten into stone. And at the center stood a new structure that had not been there before. An altar. Larger than the one the cultists had built, more ornate but fundamentally the same. A platform for sacrifice wearing the trappings of ceremony. People filled the space, herded by guards who moved with nervous energy. Not the brutal efficiency of the cathedral guards, but the twitchy readiness of those who expected violence. Their weapons tracked constantly, seeking threats in the crowd. On the platform stood a figure in red armor. Canoness Lyra. Her voice carried across the plaza without amplification, trained in projection, or perhaps aided by the same acoustic design that made the cathedral's chanting inescapable. "Citizens of Sanctia Vespera, we stand at a moment of trial. The enemy has shown itself not just in demon form, but in heresy that walks among us. A man who refuses the Emperor's light. A man who tears down sacred symbols. A man who speaks against the order that has protected you for 10,000 years. She paused, letting the words settle. Kratos saw heads turn, people searching the crowd for whoever she meant. Some looked afraid. Others looked angry, seeking someone to blame for the chaos that had descended on their world. This heretic must be found. Any who shelter him share his guilt. Any who speak for him speak against the Emperor. I call upon you now as loyal servants of the throne to make your choice clear. Stand with the Imperium, or stand with those who would see it burn." The crowd remained silent. Then from somewhere in its depths, a voice rose. Young, uncertain, but audible. "He saved us. In the plaza when the demons came. He stood between us and them." Lyra's gaze found the speaker. A girl perhaps 14, her face still bearing soot from the incursion. She quailed under the canoness's attention, but did not recant. "You mistake protection for salvation." Lyra's voice remained level, but something in her expression shifted. Not anger. Something harder to read. The Emperor's servants also stood against the demons. What makes this heretic's actions worthy of your defense. He told us to stand. An older man spoke now, emboldened by the girl's courage or simply too tired to remain silent. All our lives we've been told to kneel. He said we could stand. More voices joined. Not many, but enough to create ripples through the crowd. People sharing what they had witnessed. The statue breaking. The chains questioning. The simple act of choosing to rise when commanded to remain prostrate. Lyra raised her hand, and the voices stilled. Not from fear of her weapon, but from the weight of authority she carried. When she spoke again, her words were quieter, meant for the crowd, but feeling almost like they were meant for herself. Standing is not freedom. Not when you do not understand what you stand against. The enemy is vast. It is patient. It will twist your pride into damnation so subtle, you will not know you have fallen until hell has already claimed you. Then teach us. The girl again, her voice stronger now. Teach us what we stand against, instead of just telling us to kneel. Maybe we could help. Maybe we could fight. You are not warriors. You are nothing. Kratos' voice cut through the plaza like a blade through water. He had circled to the platform's rear while Lyra spoke, moving through shadows and angles that the guard's attention missed. Now he stood behind her close enough to strike, but making no move toward violence. Lyra spun her weapon coming up, but she did not fire. They stood at what in another time might have been called a standoff, though the gap in capability made such term almost laughable. She could kill him or die trying. He could kill her without effort, but both knew that either action would simply prove the other's point. You, she breathed. You dare show yourself in the open? You were speaking of me. I thought I should be present for my own heresy trial. This is not a trial. Heretics are not afforded trials. Yes, gods never offer those to their enemies. Kratos turned slightly, addressing the crowd as much as Lyra. They offer only submission or death. Call it different names, use different ceremonies. The chains remain. These people need structure. They need order. Without it, they will tear themselves apart or be torn apart by things far worse than any mortal cruelty. Perhaps you need them to need you. To justify the cruelty you inflict by pointing to greater cruelties waiting beyond the walls. Lyra's hand tightened on her weapon. I have walked through demon-infested war zones. I have watched entire worlds burn because they chose freedom over faith. I know what waits in the dark. You know nothing. I know gods. I know what they take and what they promise. I know that every pantheon justifies its demands by pointing to greater evils. Zeus claimed he alone prevented chaos. Ares promised protection from enemy armies. All of them were lying. The emperor is not a god. Then why do you worship him? The question hung in the air like smoke. Lyra's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Whatever response she formulated died before reaching her lips because the answer was too obvious. They did worship him. They called him God Emperor. They built cathedrals and demanded prayers and punished those who questioned. Whether he was actually divine or merely powerful enough to demand worship made no difference to those who knelt. Enough. Lyra's voice hardened, certainty rebuilding after its momentary crack. Your words are poison. I should execute you here for the heresy you speak. Then do it. But know that the crowd watches. They will see you kill someone for asking questions, for suggesting they stand instead of kneel. That image will remain long after my body cools. You seek martyrdom. That is the oldest trick. I seek nothing. I simply refuse to pretend that chains are comfort, because their alternative is worse. Lyra raised her weapon, aiming directly at his chest. Her finger moved to the trigger and stopped, not from hesitation, from new sound filling the plaza, the deep thrum of engines descending from above. Ships smaller than the massive vessels that had brought the Grey Knights, but still substantial, their hulls bearing symbols Kratos did not recognize. The crowd scattered, seeking whatever cover the plaza offered. Guards moved to defensive positions, weapons tracking the descending craft. Even Lyra lowered her gun, fractionally torn between the immediate threat of Kratos and the potential threat from above. The ships landed in formation, their ramps descending with hydraulic precision. What emerged were warriors in armor that combined elements he had seen before. The red of Lyra's forces mixed with the black of the guards, adorned with symbols that suggested authority beyond military rank. At their head walked a woman in robes rather than armor, her face partially concealed behind a mask of worked metal. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Canoness Lyra, you will stand down. Lyra's weapon did not move from Kratos, but her attention shifted. Inquisitor Cast, I was not informed of your arrival. The Inquisition does not announce itself. The masked woman descended her ramp, warriors flanking her in protective formation. We received reports of a Xenos incursion, a demon manifestation, and now a heretic who walks openly while you debate theology in public forums. The situation is complex, Inquisitor. This individual has demonstrated both hostile and protective behaviors. He requires proper evaluation before he requires termination. Cast's tone held no room for discussion. But first, he requires interrogation. Yield him to my custody. Kratos looked between them, these servants of the same god, arguing over jurisdiction like priests debating which temple had rightful claim to a sacrifice. He had seen such disputes in Athens and Sparta, in every city where multiple temples competed for believers and resources. I do not yield to anyone. Cast's masked face turned toward him fully. Behind the worked metal eyes studied him with the intensity of someone cataloging a specimen. You are classified as a threat to the Imperium. Your surrender is not requested. It is demanded. You will be contained, interrogated, and processed according to inquisitorial protocol. Or you will be destroyed, along with everyone who witnessed your heresy and might carry its infection to other districts. The crowd, already frightened, pressed further back at these words. They understood the implication. Collective punishment was not empty threat in the Imperium. It was standard procedure. Kratos looked at them at faces marked by lives spent in service to powers they had never chosen. At the girl who had spoken up. At the old man who had called his words worth defending. At hundreds of others who had simply had the misfortune to be present when gods decided to play their games. You would kill them for hearing words. I would kill them for being compromised. The Imperium cannot afford risks, not with the enemies we face. Then you create the very threat you claim to prevent. Kill enough for questioning their chains, and eventually they conclude the chains are the enemy. Philosophy from a heretic. Cast's hand moved to her belt, producing a device that hummed with building energy. Your words confirm your corruption. No pure human would think such thoughts. You are clearly touched by the warp, and warp-touched things must be purged. She activated the device. Light erupted from it, not the red of lass weapons or the brass of demon fire, but something cleaner, colder. Energy that sought to unmake, rather than burn to erase, rather than destroy. Kratos moved. He closed the distance before the device could discharge fully, one hand closing on Cast's wrist, while the other caught the weapon. For a moment they stood frozen, strength against strength, will against will. "Release me, or my warriors will fire into the crowd." Kratos looked past her to the armored figures, saw their weapons already tracking civilians, saw mothers pulling children close, saw people who had been herded into the plaza for forced witness, now trapped as hostages. He released Cast. She stepped back, weapon still in hand, a thin smile visible behind her mask. "Wiser than you appear. Perhaps interrogation will yield useful data after all." "Inquisitor," Lyra's voice carried a note of protest. "The crowd is contaminated. Standard decontamination protocols will be applied. Confession penance, and for those who spoke in the heretic's defense, harsher measures. This is not your concern, Canoness. Return to your duties." Lyra did not move. Kratos saw something working behind her eyes, some calculation, or perhaps some struggle between training and whatever doubt he had managed to plant. Then she spoke quietly, but clearly. "They defended him because he saved their lives. Is protection against demons now considered heresy?" Cast turned slowly, her masked face regarding Lyra with new assessment. "You question protocol, Canoness. I question the wisdom of punishing people for gratitude. Gratitude toward a heretic is itself heresy. You know this. You have enforced this. Do not let temporary sentiment cloud your judgment." "My judgment is clear, Inquisitor. What I question is..." The ground shook, not earthquake, but something more purposeful. A tremor that built in rhythm like massive footsteps approaching. From the plaza's far end came sound that Kratos recognized from the lower districts. Brass scraping stone, wings beating air too thick to carry their weight properly. Karzul had returned. The demon crashed through the plaza's outer wall, its reformation complete. It looked exactly as it had, before every wound, healed armor, restored axe gleaming with fresh hunger. And when it saw Kratos, it roared with what might have been joy. "I told you, God Slayer. We meet again. Khorne's servants do not die. They merely pause between battles." Cast's warriors opened fire immediately. Bolt rounds, las beams, and weapons Kratos did not recognize all converged on the daemon. They struck armor that rang like bells, carved furrows in brass that healed before the next volley could exploit them. Accomplished precisely nothing, except to draw the demon's attention. Mortals, always so eager to feed the throne. Karzul's axe swept through a rank of warriors, bisecting 3, and sending 2 more flying into walls, with force that broke both armor and bodies beneath. "But I come not for you. I come for him." The demon pointed directly at Kratos. "Khorne has made his offer. Serve or resist. Live in eternal battle or die and be forgotten. Choose now, God Slayer." Kratos drew his weapons. Around him, the plaza had descended into chaos. Guards firing uselessly at the demon. Civilians fleeing toward exits that were already sealing as Cast's protocols locked down the district. Lyra forming her sisters into a defensive formation, prayers rising to combat the demon's presence. And through it all, Karzul advanced on him with single-minded purpose. "I already chose." "Then you chose poorly." They clashed again. Axe against blades, demon flesh against scarred skin, the same fight they had fought below, but now with an audience of thousands. Kratos fell into the familiar rhythm. Strike the joints, hamstring when possible. Carve until nothing remains but smoke and promises of return. But even as he fought, he felt the futility. He could banish this demon 1,000 times, and it would return 1,001. Every victory was temporary, every wound healed. The war had no ending. Around them, others fought. Lyra's prayers actually seemed to harm the demon in ways that weapons could not, her faith cutting deeper than bullets. Caste's warriors died in job lots, but their sacrifice bought moments that others exploited. Even the civilians, trapped and terrified, found ways to help. Throwing debris, calling warnings, doing what mortals had always done when gods and monsters clashed above their heads. They survived in the gaps between titans. Kratos saw it all while fighting, saw how this universe worked. The powerful fought endless wars. The powerless died or adapted, or occasionally, very occasionally, found ways to matter despite their insignificance. It was not so different from Greece, just more honest about its cruelty. He drove both blades into Karzul's chest, crossed them, and ripped outward with all his strength. The demon came apart, brass armor shattering warp flesh, dissolving the whole massive form, collapsing inward as it lost cohesion. "Until next time, God Slayer," the demon's final words echoed as it dissolved into smoke that stank of battlefields and burning cities. Kratos stood in the aftermath, breathing hard, surrounded by bodies and blood, and the evidence that victory meant nothing. When the defeated simply respawned, Caste approached her weapon ready, but not yet aimed. "Impressive. You banished it without prayer or sanctification. Whatever you are dangerous. I am a man. Men die to such things. You are something else." She gestured to her remaining warriors. "Contain him. Full suppression protocols." They moved to comply, but Lyra's voice stopped them. "Inquisitor, he just saved this plaza. Again. Perhaps we should what canoness? Thank him for killing a demon that would not have appeared if he had not drawn its attention. Reward him for fighting a battle he himself created." The demons were coming regardless. The ritual in the lower districts was also interrupted by him. Every incident on this world traces back to his arrival. The most logical solution is his removal. Kratos watched them argue, these servants of the same god, unable to agree on whether he was useful or dangerous. He had seen such disputes before. They always ended the same way, with someone making a decision that suited their agenda and calling it divine will. He chose not to wait for their verdict. He moved toward the plaza's edge where the demon's attack had torn down enough wall to create an exit. Caste's warriors opened fire, but he was already in motion, using rubble for cover, moving too fast for their tracking to compensate. "Stop him!" Lyra's sisters moved to block his path, but their hearts were not in it. He saw it in their positioning and the way their weapons tracked slightly off target, giving him the gaps he needed to slip through their line. Then he was out descending into the levels below, where the structure became labyrinthine enough to lose even determined pursuit. Behind him, he heard Caste screaming orders, Lyra trying to maintain some form of control. And beneath it all, the sound of civilians being herded into confinement for the crime of witnessing. Kratos ran deeper into the structure, into places where the Imperium's control thinned to threads, where people survived in cracks between oversight. He needed to understand this reality better. Needed to know if there was any way to break a cycle that seemed designed to be eternal. And somewhere in the depths, he heard laughter. Not human, not demon. Something else. Something that watched and waited and found amusement in struggles against inevitability. He ignored it and kept running. Running toward answers he did not yet have, away from gods he had learned not to trust. The same pattern across different cosmos. Flee the divine. Fight when cornered. Refuse to kneel regardless of consequence. It had worked in Greece. Perhaps it would work here. Or perhaps this time the war truly would be eternal. Either way, he would face it standing. He had made that choice long ago, and nothing in this grim universe would make him reconsider. The depths had no light. Kratos descended through levels where even the failing illumination strips had long since expired. The only guidance came from the faint glow of fungi growing in moisture-slick patches on walls, their bioluminescence weak but sufficient to navigate by. The air here tasted of stagnant water and chemical decay, of things that had died and been left to rot because no one cared enough to remove them. He had been moving for hours, or perhaps days. Time became fluid in the dark, measured only by the rhythm of footsteps and the occasional encounter with those who made their lives in these forgotten spaces. They scattered when they saw him, their eyes reflecting the fungal glow like animals disturbed in their dens. He did not pursue them. They were survivors, nothing more. Not threats, not targets, just people who had fallen through whatever systems existed above and landed here where falling further meant only death. The corridor ahead changed. The walls became less regular, the floor less level. Natural stone mixed with worked architecture, as though the builders had encountered something older and simply incorporated it rather than removing it. Kratos had seen similar patterns in Greece, where newer temples had been built atop ancient shrines, layering worship upon worship, until no one remembered what had been honored first. He rounded a corner and stopped. The space beyond defied architecture. It was too large to exist within the structure's dimensions, since its walls curving away into darkness that suggested depth without limit. The floor was smooth obsidian that reflected nothing despite its polish. And in the center, suspended without visible support, hung a sphere of light that hurt to perceive directly. Not the wrong light of demon incursions. Something different. Cleaner, perhaps. Or more precisely, something that pretended to be clean while hiding corruption beneath surface perfection. Kratos approached carefully, weapons ready, though he suspected steel would mean little against whatever had created this space. Each step echoed wrong, the sound returning from angles that should not exist in normal geometry. The sphere pulsed. Colors bled from it, washing across the obsidian floor in patterns that almost formed images. Almost suggested meaning. Kratos recognized the technique. Gods loved to speak in riddles and prophecy to offer revelation that required interpretation and could be twisted to serve divine purpose. He had learned not to listen. But the sphere did not offer words. It offered memory. The obsidian beneath his feet transformed, becoming sand. Greek sand, pale and fine, carrying the scent of sea salt and olive groves. The darkness overhead became sky, not the gray of Sancta Vespera, but the brilliant blue of Mediterranean summer. And in the distance, white columns rose clean and intact, bearing the architecture of Athens at its height. Kratos' hands tightened on his weapons. This was illusion. It had to be. Athens was ash. Olympus had fallen. Everything he looked upon was lie, dressed in memory. Yet it felt real. The warmth of sunlight on his skin. The sound of waves breaking against shore. Even the faint music carried from the city lyres playing melodies he had not heard since before Ares had taken everything. Movement caught his eye. A woman walked along the beach, her gait familiar, in ways that made his chest constrict. She turned and he saw her face. Lysandra, his wife. Dead 10 years or 1,000 times, becoming meaningless, measured against the weight of what he had lost. She smiled, the expression he remembered from mornings waking beside her, from evenings watching their daughter play. The smile that had made him believe, however briefly, that a Spartan warrior might find peace. She spoke, and her voice was exactly as he remembered. Kratos, come, rest. You have fought long enough. He did not move, could not move, because this was cruelty beyond anything he had endured. To show him what he had destroyed, to offer return to a time before everything had turned to ash and blood. Another figure appeared, smaller, running across the sand with the uncoordinated energy of the very young. His daughter. Her laughter carried on the sea breeze, pure and unmarked by knowledge of what would come. She called to him, arms outstretched, wanting to be lifted and spun as he had done 1,000 times before Ares' betrayal. Father, you came back. Kratos felt something break inside his chest, not his will, something deeper. The scar tissue that had formed over wounds that could never heal. He had spent lifetimes convincing himself he did not deserve forgiveness, that carrying guilt was penance for unforgivable acts. But this was not forgiveness. This was temptation dressed in love's memory. A voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere, layered like wind through different chambers, musical and wrong. You can have this. What was taken can be returned. Kneel to us, and we will remake what was unmade. Your family, your city, your life before the gods destroyed it. Kratos' jaw clenched. No. You refuse paradise. Refuse to undo the very slaughter that has defined your existence. We offer erasure of guilt, Kratos of Sparta. We offer redemption without the burden of having earned it. Lies. Truth. The voice carried absolute certainty, the kind that came from entities who had spent eons perfecting deception. We are Tsanch, the changer of ways. We unmake what is and remake what was. Time bends, fate shifts. Reality becomes malleable in our hands. Kneel, and we will give you back everything. The scene shifted. Olympus rose before him, but not the Olympus of tyrant gods. This was the realm as it had appeared in his childhood. When Sparta's legends spoke of divine glory, and he had believed, however briefly, that power might be wielded justly. The halls gleamed with marble and gold that had not yet been stained by the blood of those who questioned. Gardens bloomed with flowers that would later be trampled by armies marching to wars, fought for divine amusement. And at the center stood Zeus, not the tyrant Kratos had killed. The father he had imagined before learning what gods truly were. This Zeus smiled with what might have been genuine warmth, extending a hand not to command, but to welcome. My son, come, be reconciled. The war is over. We begin anew. Kratos stared at the figure, at this lie, dressed in memory's wishful thinking. He had never known this Zeus. This version had existed only in the imagination of a child who wanted to believe in heroes and gods, who deserved worship rather than demanding it. That child had died in Athens' temple, burned, family slaughtered when Ares had taught him the truth about divine love. You show me what never was. Kratos said, his voice cutting through the illusion's false peace. You offer comfort built on lies. Memory revised until it bears no resemblance to truth. We offer hope. Is that not what you have sought across lifetimes of violence? The chance to undo, to return, to save what was lost. Hope built on forgetting is not hope. It is surrender. The scene rippled Zeus's smile, becoming something else. Ares appeared beside him, then Athena, then the entire pantheon reassembling around Kratos in a mockery of divine counsel. But their faces were wrong, their eyes holding colors the gods had never possessed. Too many hues layered one atop another, shifting with each blink. Then we offer knowledge. Tsinch's voice suggested the pantheon speaking in unison. understanding of the patterns that govern existence, the truth you sought when you climbed Olympus and found only tyrants wearing crowns. We can show you the why behind the cruelty, the purpose behind the pain. Would that not be worth submission? There is no purpose. Gods are cruel because they have power and no one to check them. That is the only truth I need. Incorrect. The scene changed again faster, now images flashing in rapid succession. Other worlds, other pantheons, other versions of Kratos, standing before different gods, fighting different wars, but always ending in the same ash and blood. You are a pattern, Kratos of Sparta. A cycle that repeats across infinite variations. God-slayer, oath-breaker, the one who climbs to divine heights and tears them down. Your point? The pattern has purpose. You are correction incarnate. When gods become corrupt, you appear. When worship becomes poison, you arrive to administer the cure. You are inevitable, and we wish to employ your inevitability in our grand design. Kratos felt something shift in the illusion's weight. This was no longer simple temptation. This was something more dangerous. A truth wrapped in lies, or perhaps a lie masquerading as truth. He had learned long ago that the most effective deceptions contained elements of accuracy. I serve no designs, mine or anyone else's. You already serve. You simply choose not to acknowledge it. But we can offer conscious purpose rather than blind repetition. Join us, and your slaughters will have meaning. Your wars will reshape reality according to plan rather than leaving only chaos in their wake. The images stopped, replaced by a single scene. The plaza where he had fought demons, where civilians had spoken in his defense, where Lyra had questioned her inquisitor. But in this version, the ending changed. The people rose. Not in simple standing, but in full revolt, throwing off chains, both literal and metaphorical. The Imperium's guards fell. The statues toppled. And at the center, Kratos stood as the symbol they rallied around the saint of liberation, the god of broken chains. This, Tsench whispered, is what we offer. Not erasure of your past, but fulfillment of your purpose. You despise gods who demand worship. Become the god who refuses it. Lead by example. Show them how to stand. Is that not what you want? Kratos stared at the vision, at people fighting for freedom from tyranny, using his example as catalyst. It was seductive precisely because it mirrored what he had told himself in Greece. That destroying Olympus would free humanity from divine tyranny. That sometimes the chainbreaker had to become the chainbreaker's symbol. And it had worked. For exactly as long as it took new gods to arise, new tyrants to fill the vacuum, new chains to replace the old. Because people wanted to worship, wanted to believe, wanted someone stronger to follow, so they did not have to make choices themselves. You show me rebellion that leads to new worship. Liberation that becomes new slavery. I know this pattern. I created it. Then create it consciously. Guide the transition. Prevent the corruption from taking root. You failed in Greece because you destroyed without building. We offer you the chance to do both. The vision shifted one final time, and Kratos saw himself not as warrior, but as architect. Standing before people who looked to him not with worship, but with respect, learning from his example, rather than demanding he lead. A world where the lesson he had tried to teach stand, do not kneel, actually took root. It was beautiful. It was possible. It was everything he had failed to achieve before. And it was a lie. Kratos looked down at his hands, at the scars that marked them, at the ash that would never wash away. He knew himself well enough by now to recognize the truth. He was not a builder. He was not a teacher. He was destruction and destruction alone. When he broke chains, people built new ones because that was what people did. They needed structure, needed guidance, needed someone to tell them which way to go. He could not give them that. Could only show them what not to follow. You offer me a role I cannot fill. Cannot or will not. Both. Then you choose to remain broken, to carry guilt without purpose, to wander without destination, to destroy without creation. We offer meaning, and you reject it out of stubbornness. I reject it, Kratos said quietly, because you are lying. The obsidian floor cracked beneath his feet. The visions wavered their edges, becoming less stable. Tzeentch's voice lost its musical quality, becoming sharper, more frustrated. How dare you? You are God. Kratos drove his blade into the floor, shattering the perfect surface. You claim to offer what I want, but you are incapable of giving it. Because what I want is for gods to stop existing, for people to stop being offered comfort in exchange for chains, for the cycle to end. We offer that ending. No, you offer management of the cycle. Control over who wears chains and who holds the keys. It is the same crime dressed in different rhetoric. I have seen Zeus in you. I have seen Ares. I have seen every god who claimed their tyranny was necessary for the greater good. The illusions collapsed. The beach, the Olympus, the visions of purpose and meaning, all of them dissolved like smoke touched by wind. What remained was the obsidian chamber. But now Kratos could see the cracks in its construction, could see where the geometry was held together by will rather than structure. And in the center, where the sphere of light had hung, he saw something else. A shape not quite present in normal space. Tentacles that existed in too many dimensions. Eyes that were not eyes, but apertures through which something vast beyond comprehension observed this reality. Tzeentch, not in full manifestation, but an avatar in fragment in the smallest piece of itself that could interact with mortal plane. It looked at him with something approaching respect. You see clearly, Kratos of Sparta. Few mortals can perceive our true nature and maintain sanity. But clarity changes nothing. The cycle continues regardless of your refusal. You will be offered salvation by every god you meet. Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh. Each will show you different faces of the same bargain. Serve and have meaning. Refuse and have nothing. I choose nothing. Then you are a fool. I am a man. Kratos pulled his blade from the shattered floor and turned toward the exit. Behind him, Tzeentch's laughter echoed through the impossible geometry, not mocking, but genuinely amused. Yes, a man. The greatest joke of all. Gods offer you divinity and you choose mortality. Power and you choose weakness. Eternity and you choose finitude. We do not understand you, Kratos, and that makes you interesting. The chamber began to collapse. Not physically, but conceptually, its existence predicated on Tzeentch's attention and will. As those withdrew, the space lost cohesion, folding back into whatever place such things dwelled between manifestations. Kratos ran for the exit stone crumbling behind him as architecture designed by thought rather than physics returned to non-existence. He burst through the doorway, back into the fungal-lit corridor, and the passage sealed behind him with a sound like reality sighing in relief. He stood breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the effort of resisting temptation that had been tailored specifically to his wounds. Tzeentch had shown him everything he had ever wanted: family, home, purpose, meaning, the chance to undo what could never be undone. And he had refused it all, because accepting would mean becoming the very thing he had spent lifetimes fighting. Kratos began walking back toward the upper levels. He needed to leave this place, needed to find whatever way existed to escape a structure that was clearly more than simple architecture. But even as he climbed, he knew Tzeentch's words carried truth. The cycle would continue. Other gods would make their offers. The war would persist. In Greece, he had believed killing the gods would end it. Here the gods could not be killed, only banished, only delayed, only refused until they returned with new offers, new temptations, new arguments for why submission was the only sensible choice. It was exhausting. It was futile. It was eternal. But he would continue refusing, because that was all he had: the simple absolute rejection of anyone who demanded he kneel. It was not much, but it was his. The upper levels were chaos. Kratos emerged from the depths to find the cathedral district in flames. Not literal fire, but something worse. The air itself burned with energies that should not exist in stable reality. Where they touched architecture, stone warped into shapes that hurt to perceive. Where they touched people, screams rose in frequencies that bypassed ears and resonated in bone. Another incursion, larger than before. The wound between realities had torn wider, and through it poured entities that made Kar-Zul look restrained. Kratos ran toward the center of devastation. He had no plan beyond the simple imperative that had governed him in Greece: Osatius, when monsters appeared, they had to be killed. The complexity of cosmic politics and eternal cycles meant nothing in the moment when demons were tearing apart civilians too slow to flee. The plaza came into view, or what remained of it. The wound in reality had opened directly above the platform where he had fought before consuming the altar and half the surrounding structures. Through it, he saw not the darkness of space, but something else. A realm of impossible geometries and colors that should not exist, where physics was suggestion rather than law. The warp. It had to be. The place where these demons dwelled between manifestations. And it was spreading. Lyra stood at the edge of the incursion with her remaining sisters, forming a prayer line that somehow held the expanding tear at bay. Their voices rose in unison, faith made audible, creating a barrier that demons could not cross without suffering damage. But they were failing. Kratos saw it in their posture, in the way their formation shrank meter by meter as exhaustion eroded their spiritual defenses. He moved to join them, blades ready. Lyra saw him approach, and her expression shifted through several emotions, too quickly to track. Relief, anger, desperation, finally settling on grim acceptance. You returned. Did you expect otherwise? I expected pragmatism. You should have fled while the Inquisitor was distracted. Where would I flee to? The question hung unanswered as a wave of demons broke through the prayer line's weak point. Kratos met them with blades already swinging, cutting through warped flesh with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fought worse things than minor demons. But these were not alone. Behind them came greater entities, heralds and champions, bearing the marks of gods he was beginning to recognize. Khorne's brazen warriors, Tzeentch's ever-shifting horrors, and others carrying colors and symbols that suggested pantheons within pantheons, an infinite taxonomy of divine corruption. The ritual is complete, Lyra shouted over the sound of combat. Someone in the lower districts finished what the cultists began. The barrier is down. The warp is flooding through. Close it. We cannot. It requires a sacrifice of power equivalent to what was offered to open it. We do not have. Then find it. Kratos pushed deeper into the incursion's edge, where the boundary between realities blurred and fighting became metaphysical as much as physical. Here demons were strongest, because here they were most real. But so was the anchor they required to maintain manifestation. He had learned this fighting them before. They were sustained by the wound, fed by the tear, kept stable by whatever ritual had created the bridge between worlds. Cut that sustenance and they dissolved. Not killed, but demanifested, sent back to whatever hell had spawned them. He saw it in the center of the wound. Not a person or altar, but a device. Machinery merged with flesh, merged with something that was neither pulsing with energies that kept reality's scab picked open and bleeding. Around it stood cultists, but not the simple zealots he had fought before. These were armored, armed, organized, veterans of this spiritual war, priests who had perfected their dark craft. And at their head stood a figure that made even Kratos pause. It was massive, easily matching Karzul's size, but different in composition. Part demon, part human, part machine, as though someone had been transformed incrementally until no clear line remained between what they had been and what they had become. Brass armor-covered skin that writhed with symbols. Wings spread that dripped ichor caustic enough to eat through stone. And in hands that were sometimes human and sometimes claws, it held a sword that radiated power similar to the Grey Knight's weapons, but inverted, corrupted, using faith as fuel for damnation rather than salvation. It saw Kratos, and it smiled with too many teeth. The Godslayer. Khorne spoke truth. You came. Move aside. Never. This is the moment, the culmination, the prize we have worked toward for generations. This world will fall. The warp will claim it. And from its ashes will rise a new domain for the dark gods. Kratos looked past the champion at the device, keeping the wound open. Destroying it would require reaching it. Reaching it required going through this thing and its cultist guard. Simple. Direct. The kind of problem he understood. Then you die first. The champion's laughter was wrong, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple beings speaking through one throat. I am already dead. I died when I accepted Chaos's gifts. What stands before you is beyond death, beyond life, beyond any category your limited existence recognizes. Then you are nothing new. I have killed such things before. They clashed. The champion fought with skill that suggested formal training corrupted by centuries of demon-granted enhancements. Its blade moved in patterns designed to exploit vulnerabilities. Kratos did not have targeting pressure points on anatomy that had been replaced by divine augmentation long ago. When it recognized conventional technique was failing, it shifted to something else. Raw power. Overwhelming force. The kind of attack that relied on the assumption that greater strength always won. Kratos had spent his life proving that assumption wrong. He dodged the champion's overhead strike, let the blade embed in stone, then struck at the wrist while it was committed. His blade bit deep, severing tendons that were not quite tendons, cutting through flesh that was neither entirely mortal nor entirely demonic. The champion stumbled, and Kratos pressed. Blade to throat, blade to chest, blade to every joint where armor had to flex. The champion bled, but its blood burned where it fell, eating into stone like the demon's ichor. Around them the battle continued. Lyra's sisters fighting to hold the line. Cultists dying to demon possession and imperial fire equally. And above it all, the wound in reality growing wider as the device pulsed with increasing fervor. The champion fell its form, losing cohesion as the demon aspect separated from the human aspect, separated from the mechanical augmentation. All three dissolved in different directions, screaming in different frequencies, leaving only armor and ash where it had stood. Kratos did not wait for speeches or final words. He ran for the device. Cultists moved to block him, but they were amateurs compared to what he had already killed. His blades found them without conscious thought, muscle memory from 10,000 battles guiding each strike. Some fell screaming. Others simply fell dying too quickly to register surprise. He reached the device and studied its construction. Part ritual circle, part machinery, part something organic that pulsed like a heart. The three components fed each other in a cycle that seemed designed for stability rather than power. Break one and the others would compensate. Damage all three simultaneously, or the wound would remain. Kratos called to Lyra without looking away from the device. "How do I destroy this?" Her voice came from closer than expected. She had followed abandoning her prayer line to her second-in-command. "You cannot. Not without power equivalent to, show me where to strike." She hesitated, then pointed to 3 locations on the device. The ritual circle's heart, the machine's core, the organic component's primary organ. All 3 at once, but you lack the reach. You need Kratos' blades extended, not physically, but through force of will, through the bond forged in Greek hell between weapon and wielder. The blades of chaos had always been more than simple steel. They were artifacts of divine punishment chains that bound him to service, and simultaneously gave him the means to destroy his masters. Now he used that power. 3 strikes launched simultaneously, each blade splitting into multiple chains that wrapped around their targets. He pulled. The ritual circle shattered. The machine core fractured. The organic heart burst, and the device screamed. It was not metaphorical. The device itself screamed a sound that came from all 3 components at once, overlapping in harmonics that suggested each piece had been conscious aware, suffering its existence as fuel for the wound. They died gratefully, their termination almost ecstatic. The wound began to close. Not immediately, not cleanly, but like a scab forming over a fresh cut, reality's skin started to knit together. Diamonds on the wrong side of the barrier shrieked as they felt their manifestation becoming unstable. Some fled back through the narrowing gap. Others stayed determined to kill as much as possible before being banished. Karzul was among the latter. The bloodthirster emerged from the crowd of lesser demons like a general rallying troops for final assault. It saw Kratos and did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They had fought twice already. This would be the third and perhaps the last before the wound sealed completely. They met in the center of carnage blades, against axe mortal, against divine. Around them, the world burned. Above them, reality sealed itself. Neither noticed. They were locked in the pure simplicity of combat, stripped of all purpose save the fight itself. Kratos carved another wound in the demon's flesh. Karzul's axe opened a gash across Kratos' chest that would have killed any normal man. They bled together, their blood mixing on stone worn smooth by centuries of worship. "You fight well, God Slayer. I wish we had more time. Die faster then." Karzul laughed, a sound like armies clashing. "I cannot die, not here, not anywhere. But I can be delayed. I suppose that is victory of sorts." The demon's form began to dissolve as the wound shrank past the threshold needed to sustain its manifestation. It looked at Kratos with something that might have been respect. "Until next time, and there will be a next time, Khorne's gaze has found you. The blood god does not forget worthy prey." Then it was gone, pulled back through the closing wound, along with every other demon that had not fled in time. The tear sealed with a sound like thunder played backward, and sudden silence filled the plaza. Kratos stood in the aftermath, bleeding from a dozen wounds that would scar, but not kill. Around him lay the dead. Cultists, sisters of battle, civilians who had been too slow or too unlucky. The price of survival measured in bodies. Lyra approached her armor scarred and scorched her face pale with exhaustion. "You destroyed it. The anchor. You sealed the incursion. It will open again. Perhaps, but not today." She looked at him with an expression too complex to name. "You saved this district again." "I fought what needed fighting, that is all." "No, that is not all." She gestured at the plaza at the evidence of battle. "You could have fled. Should have fled. The Inquisitor has ordered your execution. Remaining here guarantees capture or death." "Then I guarantee it." "Why?" It was the question he had been asking himself. Why remain in a universe where victory was temporary and gods could not be killed? Why fight for people who would likely return to worship as soon as the immediate threat passed? Why persist in refusing when refusal changed nothing? He had no answer that would satisfy her. Could barely articulate one that satisfied himself. But he tried. Because walking away is the same as kneeling. If I flee, I acknowledge their power over me. I become the thing I hate, someone who bends to gods because resistance seems futile. But it is futile, you know this. The warp cannot be destroyed. The Imperium cannot be toppled. The cycle continues regardless of individual defiance. Then I defy cycles. Lyra studied him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am beginning to understand why they fear you. Not for your strength, for what you represent." "And what is that?" "The possibility that they are wrong." Before Kratos could respond, new sound filled the air. Not demons this time, but something more mundane and more dangerous. Ship engines. Multiple vessels descending in formation that spoke of military precision. Lyra looked up, her expression hardening. "Inquisitor Cast. She has brought reinforcements. And if I know her protocols..." She turned to Kratos, urgency replacing contemplation. "Run, now. She will not simply try to capture you. She will sterilize the entire district to ensure no heresy survives. Sterilize for orbital bombardment. She has the authority to level this district and everyone in it. She will call it necessary. She will cite protocol. And she will sleep soundly afterward, because duty matters more than lives." Kratos looked at the survivors picking through rubble, searching for wounded who might be saved. Looked at the civilians who had defended him to Lyra's face. Looked at all the people who would die if this Inquisitor followed through on her threat. "How long do I have?" "Minutes. Maybe less. The bombardment will be precise, devastating, and without warning. It is doctrine when facing demon incursion. Burn it all to be certain. Then I need to reach her ship. Impossible. She will be in high orbit, surrounded by defensive craft. You cannot... Can you get me to the surface?" Lyra hesitated, war visible in her expression between doctrine and whatever doubt Kratos had planted. Finally, she made her choice. "Follow me, quickly." They ran through corridors filling with smoke and refugees. Lyra calling orders to her sisters, who obeyed despite the obvious heresy of aiding the fugitive they had been commanded to capture. They reached a platform where a transport waited, its engines already warming. "This will take you to the surface. From there, you will need to find your own way." "Why help me?" Lyra met his gaze, and for the first time since they had met, he saw something other than certainty in her eyes. "Because if you are wrong, I lose nothing. But if you are right..." She did not finish. Did not need to. The implications were too vast, too dangerous to speak aloud. Kratos boarded the transport. As it lifted off, he looked back at Lyra standing on the platform, her armor reflecting the fires that consumed the district. She raised her hand, not in salute, but in acknowledgement of something neither of them could name. The transport punched through into the gray sky, and Kratos prepared for what would come next. He needed to stop an orbital bombardment, needed to prevent mass murder dressed up as necessity, needed to do what he had always done when gods decided entire populations were acceptable losses. He needed to reach the ones giving orders and make them reconsider, or make them join their victims in death. Either outcome would suffice. The transport climbed toward where ships hung in orbit, like steel gods preparing to rain judgment on those below. Kratos stood at the viewport, watching them grow larger, and felt a familiar sensation settle in his chest. Not fear, not doubt, just the cold certainty that came from knowing the next battle would decide whether thousands lived or died. It was the same choice he had faced in Greece: stand or kneel, fight or flee. Accept that some deaths were necessary, or refuse that logic and make the powerful answer for their power. He had chosen before. He chose now. The same answer across different cosmos. He would not kneel. He would not flee. He would climb to wherever these gods sat and drag them down to face those they had deemed expendable. It was not much of a plan, but it was his. And as the Greek gods had learned, sometimes spite and refusal were sufficient to topple divine thrones. The ships loomed ahead, weapons charging with light that would soon become fire. Kratos' hands found his weapons, and he smiled without humor. Let them try their bombardment. Let them command from safety. Let them believe altitude made them untouchable. He had climbed Olympus. He would climb this too. And when he reached the summit, he would teach them the same lesson Zeus had learned. Gods bleed, and mortals remember. The transport never reached the orbital ships. Kratos felt it the moment reality twisted wrong. The viewport showed stars that should not move, yet they drifted like debris caught in invisible currents. The metal beneath his feet became uncertain, as though the transport could not decide whether it was solid or suggestion. Then the wound opened. Not ahead or behind, but everywhere at once, reality peeling back like skin from a corpse to reveal what lay beneath. The transport's hull screamed metal, protesting as it was pulled through a gap it was never designed to traverse. Kratos grabbed supports that melted under his hands, sought purchase on surfaces that forgot they were surfaces. The warp took him. He fell through spaces that were not space, saw colors that made his eyes bleed, heard sounds that bypassed ears entirely to resonate in bone and marrow. The transition was not instant. It felt like drowning, like being crushed, like every method of death experienced simultaneously, but never quite completing. Then he struck something solid. Kratos lay on a surface that resembled stone but felt wrong. Too smooth, too cold. Like metal pretending to be rock, or rock that had learned to think and chosen malice. He pushed himself up, weapons already in hand despite having no memory of drawing them. The warp stretched before him. It was not a place. not in any sense that minds designed for material reality could properly parse. But Kratos' eyes, accustomed to horrors beyond mortal comprehension, tried nonetheless. He saw landscapes that existed in too many dimensions, architecture that folded through itself in geometries that made mathematical mockery. Seas of something that was neither liquid nor solid, but some third state that reality had not previously conceived. And everywhere always movement. Entities drifted through this realm like fish through water. If fish were made from screaming faces, and water was anguish given form. They noticed him these things, and some approached with curiosity that felt like claws scraping against consciousness. But they did not attack. Not yet. Perhaps they recognized him, or perhaps something about his nature repelled even here in their home territory. A voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome, God's Slayer, to the place where gods are born." It was not Korn's brass violence or Tzeentch's musical deception. This was something else. Multiple voices overlapping male and female, and neither speaking in languages that should not harmonize, but did anyway, creating meaning from discord. Kratos turned slowly, seeking the source, found nothing but the endless expanse of unreality that stretched in directions physical space did not permit. You need not seek us. We are here. We are there. We are the warp itself, given temporary focus to speak with one who interests us. Show yourself. Laughter echoed from walls that did not exist. We have no self to show, not yet. We are becoming. Always becoming. Emotion made manifest, thought given weight. The collective unconscious of a billion souls, all screaming and singing and weeping into the void. Kratos understood then. This was not a god, not even a demon. This was the warp itself speaking, or some fraction of it organized enough to communicate. He had heard of such things in Greek mythology. Chaos itself gaining voice, primordial forces that predated even the Olympians. Why speak to me? Because you are interesting. You refuse gods, yet you are here in the realm where gods are birthed. You deny worship, yet you cannot die, not truly not, while such refusal defines your existence. You are paradox made flesh, and we feed on paradoxes. The landscape shifted. Kratos saw Athens burning, but it was not the Athens he had destroyed. This was different, changed. In the flames, he glimpsed faces he almost recognized, wearing expressions he had seen on other worlds, in other battles. The pattern repeating across infinite variations. You see it now. The cycle. God Slayer appears, gods fall, new gods rise. The pattern perpetuates because mortality requires power, and power corrupts until gods emerge. You cannot break this cycle. You are part of it. I broke Olympus. And what grew in the ashes, Rome claimed divine emperors. Christianity crowned a carpenter's son as God. Islam elevated prophets to nearness with the divine. Humanity craves worship. You cannot kill what eternally resurrects in different forms. Kratos felt the weight of that truth settle like ash on his shoulders. He had spent lifetimes believing that destroying gods would free humanity. But perhaps the warp was right. Perhaps people simply created new gods because the alternative standing without divine guidance was too terrifying to contemplate. Then there is no ending. There is only the eternal struggle. The warp feeds on emotion. Gods emerge from worship. Mortals suffer under divine tyranny. Rebellions rise. Gods fall. The warp feeds. New gods emerge. The wheel turns forever, God Slayer, and you are one of its spokes. The vision changed. Kratos saw himself fighting the same battle across different worlds, different timelines, different realities, always winning, always destroying the tyrant gods, and always in the aftermath, watching new tyrants emerge. It was exhausting, it was eternal, it was hell, but it was also his choice. "If I am a spoke," Kratos said quietly, "then I choose how I turn. You have no choice. The pattern is broken every time I refuse, every time I stand when commanded to kneel, every time I walk away from the power you offer." The warp's presence seemed to ripple with something approaching frustration. "You do not understand. We are not offering power. We are explaining futility. You cannot win. The war is eternal. The gods always return. Then I fight eternally." Silence. The kind that suggested the warp was recalculating, reassessing, trying to understand logic that ran counter to everything it knew about mortal psychology. Finally, it spoke again, and this time the voice carried something new. Not respect for the warp was incapable of such emotion, but acknowledgement. "You are already damned then. The warp does not release what it claims. You will fight here until your will erodes, until you forget why you refused, until you become just another soul lost in the eternal storm. Then I am damned. You accept this fate. I accept nothing, but I will endure it." The warp seemed to withdraw its attention, focusing elsewhere as though Kratos had become temporarily boring. But it left him with a parting observation that felt like prophecy and threat combined. "We shall see how long endurance lasts when measured against infinity." Then he was alone. Kratos began walking. There was no direction in the warp, no north or south or up or down. But he walked anyway because standing still was acceptance of imprisonment. And imprisonment, like worship, was something he would never accept. Entities approached, some curious, some aggressive. He killed what attacked and ignored what did not. The fighting was constant, but purposeless, each victory meaning nothing because the defeated simply reformed elsewhere, ready to fight again. It was exactly the hell he had been warned about. Eternal combat without victory. Endless war without conclusion. The promise of rest dangled forever beyond reach. And Kratos endured it. Because that was what he was. Not a hero, not a savior. Just a man who had chosen long ago that he would stand even when standing was futile. That he would fight even when fighting changed nothing. That he would refuse even when refusal guaranteed eternal suffering. It was not much of an existence, but it was his. Time became meaningless. He fought battles that might have lasted seconds or centuries. Walked distances that could have been meters or light years. The warp did not measure in mortal increments, and his body, sustained by whatever force kept gods alive, did not hunger or thirst or age. He simply was, and fought, and endured. Occasionally the warp spoke again, offered new temptations, showed him visions of escape if only he would kneel just once to acknowledge that some powers deserved worship. Each time he refused. Each time the warp withdrew, frustrated but patient. It had eternity. It could wait. But so could Kratos. He had learned patience in Tartarus endurance, in the pits of Hades persistence, from every battle where victory had seemed impossible, but had come anyway through simple refusal to surrender. He would not surrender here either. Not to the warp. Not to its gods. Not to the logic that said eternal suffering was inevitable and resistance was futile. He would endure. He would fight. He would stand. Forever, if necessary. Because the alternative was kneeling. And he had decided long ago that some things were worth eternal damnation rather than even temporary submission. The warp could have his presence. It could trap his body in endless battle. But it could not have his will. That remained his own inviolate, the one thing no god or demon or cosmic force could claim. It was not freedom, but it was enough. Kratos walked on through landscapes that hurt to perceive past entities that whispered promises of release toward a horizon that never arrived. And with each step, he reaffirmed the choice that had defined him across lifetimes and realities. He would not kneel. Not now, not ever, not even here in hell where refusing was its own eternal punishment. Some prices were worth paying, some stands were worth taking regardless of cost. Some refusals were absolute. His was. The warp howled around him, frustrated by the soul it could trap, but never truly claim. And Kratos howled back wordless defiance that echoed through dimensions where sound should not exist. Two infinities locked in stalemate. One trying to break, one refusing to bend. Neither would win. Neither would lose. The war would simply continue as eternal as the gods it fought against. And somewhere in that eternity, Kratos found a grim satisfaction. Because eternal war was still better than even momentary surrender. He had chosen his hell, and he would endure it on his terms. No god could claim more. The Aegean was gray. Kratos surfaced through water that tasted of things that should not exist in the mortal world. His body moved through instinct, swimming toward a shore he could barely perceive through vision that had seen too much of the warp to focus properly on material reality. He did not know how he had escaped. One moment fighting in the endless storm, the next falling through a wound that opened beneath him, depositing him back into a sea. He recognized from memory older than the warp could claim. Greece. Home. Or what had once been home before gods had made such concepts meaningless. His hands found sand, real sand, solid and rough against palms that had touched things without physical form. He pulled himself onto the beach and lay there breathing air that tasted almost clean compared to the warp's psychic pollution. Almost, but not quite. Something had followed him back, or something had remained in him, carried through the barrier between realities like an infection crossing quarantine. He could feel it in his blood, in his bones, in the ash that marked his skin. The warp had left its mark. Kratos stood slowly testing limbs that remembered how to move in normal gravity under normal physics. Everything worked. Nothing broken, but different, changed, as though the experience of existing outside reality had fundamentally altered what reality could do to him. He looked down at his arms. The scars were still there, lifetimes of violence carved into flesh that could not forget. But new marks joined them now. Symbols that had not been there before, written in colors that flickered between states of being. Warp touch. The brands of a realm that did not easily release what it claimed. They did not hurt. That was almost worse. Pain he understood. Pain he could fight. But these marks simply existed. Permanent reminders that he had been claimed by forces that existed beyond the simple dichotomy of mortal and divine. He turned to survey the beach. It was the same stretch of sand where he had met the fishermen in what felt like lifetimes ago. The same place where Lysandra had walked with their daughter before Ares had taken everything. But it was not the same. The sand was grayer, the air heavier, the horizon darker despite the sun struggling through clouds that looked wrong, as though they could not quite remember how to be clouds properly. Greece had changed while he was gone. Or perhaps he had changed and now saw the world through eyes that had glimpsed what lay beneath reality's skin. A sound made him turn. Not footsteps the warp had taught him to recognize those, but something else. The scrape of metal on stone, the wheeze of machinery that had forgotten how to function properly. From the ruins of what had once been a temple emerged a figure. Human in outline, but wrong in detail. Its movements too jerky, too mechanical, as though it was a body piloted by something that did not quite understand how bodies worked. It saw Kratos and stopped. For a long moment they studied each other. The thing that had been human. The man who had traveled beyond humanity's boundaries and returned carrying pieces of elsewhere. Then it spoke, and its voice was layered with whispers that made Kratos' new marks burn cold. Blood. Just that single word spoken with longing and hunger and recognition. The warp's influence spreading even here, even in Greece, even in the ruins of Olympus where gods had fallen. Kratos understood then. The warp was not simply another realm. It was infection, corruption, a spiritual disease that spread wherever consciousness existed. He had carried it back. Or perhaps it had always been here, waiting for someone to open doors that should have remained sealed. He drew his weapons. The thing that had been human smiled with too many teeth and lunged. The fight was brief. The creature was strong, possessed by energies similar to what he had faced in the warp, but it was new to such power. Clumsy, unrefined. Kratos had spent eternity fighting such things in their home territory. Here in material reality, where physics still mostly applied, they were almost easy. He cut it down, and it dissolved into ash that smelled of brass and broken promises. But there would be more. He knew this with the certainty of someone who had seen the pattern repeat across realities. The warp had touched Greece. Either through his return or through some other breach, it had found purchase here. And where the warp took root, gods would follow. New gods. Different from the Olympians, but fundamentally the same. Entities born from worship and emotion, demanding submission and offering power in exchange for souls. Kratos looked toward the ruins of Olympus in the distance. He had destroyed one pantheon. Now, he would have to face another, and another, and another, because the cycle never ended. The warp had been right about that much, but it had been wrong about everything else. The cycle did not control him. He controlled his response to it. And his response would remain the same across however many iterations it took. Refuse, fight, stand, never kneel. He began walking inland toward the ruins where new corruption would be taking root. Toward the next battle in an eternal war. Toward gods he had not met yet, but would fight with the same absolute rejection he had shown all the others. The marks on his arms pulsed with each step, warp, taint, and mortal flesh locked in uneasy coexistence. He was damned, now truly damned, carrying the infection of elsewhere in his very being. But damnation was just another cage. And cages were meant to be broken. Greece's gray sky watched him go. The sea murmured behind him. And from somewhere in the ruins ahead, he heard it. Chanting. The same pattern he had heard in Sanctia Vespera. Different words, different language, but the same fundamental pattern. Worship, submission. The sound of people creating new gods because they could not bear the weight of existing without divine guidance. Kratos' hands tightened on his weapons. Let them worship. Let them build altars. Let them call their new gods by whatever names they chose. When those gods revealed themselves, and they always revealed themselves, eventually he would be waiting. Because that was what he was now. Not hero, not villain, not even particularly human anymore, not with warp marks burning cold on his flesh and memories of eternity fresh in his mind. He was simply the thing that happened to gods when they demanded too much. The correction, the consequence. The reminder that worship was not divine right, but borrowed time. And his time was eternal. The ruins of Olympus rose ahead, and Kratos walked toward them without hesitation or hope. Just grim determination to do what he had always done. Fight what needed fighting. Refuse what needed refusing. Stand when everyone else knelt. Forever if necessary. The warp had taught him that forever was possible. That eternity was not metaphor, but literal reality. That some wars truly never ended. Very well. He had chosen his war. He would fight it. For as long as consciousness persisted and gods arose to claim dominion over mortals who deserved better than divine tyranny, the cycle would continue. The gods would rise, and Kratos would be there to tear them down, bearing the scars of every battle, carrying the weight of eternal refusal marked by the warp, but never claimed by it. It was not redemption. It was not salvation. It was barely even existence. But it was his choice, made freely, maintained absolutely. The one thing no god or demon or cosmic force could take. His will remained his own, and that Kratos had learned across lifetimes and realities was all anyone truly had. The power to choose how they stood against what sought to make them kneel. He chose to stand, now, always, forever. Let the gods come, let the cycle turn, let eternity stretch before him like an infinite battlefield. He would meet it on his feet, weapons in hand, ash on his shoulders, and refusal in his heart. Some things were worth eternal damnation. Freedom was one of them. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but even in endless war, some souls refuse to kneel. This is their damnation. This is their glory. This is the price of choosing freedom over mercy. Consequence over comfort, eternal defiance over momentary peace. The gods may be eternal, but so is the one who slays them, and the cycle continues forever without end. Years later, inquisitors would debate what he had been. Xenos, warp-touched, ancient weapon from the dark age of technology. The official records listed him as Threat Classification Omega Null Neutralized via Dimensional Exile. But the people remembered differently. In the lower hives of Sanctia Vespera, a new prayer emerged. Not to the Emperor, not to any god. Just 3 words whispered by those who had seen him fight: stand, do not kneel. Canoness Lyra stood trial for heresy. Her defense was simple. She had witnessed the impossible and chosen truth over doctrine. The Inquisition found her guilty. Her sisters called her saint. The cult spread slowly, carefully, a virus of doubt in the Imperium's absolute certainty. Not rebellion, not chaos. Simply the dangerous idea that perhaps worship was not mandatory. That perhaps humanity could stand without gods commanding from thrones. The Inquisition hunted these believers with particular fury. Not because they worshipped chaos, because they worshipped nothing at all. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that was the greatest heresy imaginable.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.